the EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests.
The thing about leadership in a union context is it's kind of an inverse model for the way leadership works pretty much everywhere else, because there's this whole kind of, it's funny, I mean, this is quite opposite given what we're going to be talking about actually in some ways, but the traditional model of leadership, you know, of which Urquhart's a kind of almost an idealized version, right?
Urquhart in 4 minutes there, Kit. That's good.
Not bad, huh?
Yeah.
Not bad. Ruthlessly on topic for me, that was. But like, yeah, so you know how like he's kind of, he is in some ways a platonic ideal of the villainous leader, right? He's like the ultimate Shakespeare villain. He's like, we talked about that last time, he's all of them rolled into one, right? I mean, he even quotes Macbeth in this one, but you know, so that's that idea. And that, you know, that kind of leader is someone who shapes opinion, who pushes people forward, who, you know, gets rid of people who don't agree with them, who, you know, has a ruthless pursuit of a particular vision. Leadership in a union capacity really is, if you're doing it right, I think anyway, the opposite of that. You are led entirely by what your members tell you is important to them, or you should be. You know, you're democratically elected by them to represent their views and their interests and their concerns. I think there is a real, it's funny actually, I hadn't really put this together before. I actually do think part of the problem we've got at the moment, and part of the problem we often have in the union movement, is there is a language barrier, you know, because we will talk about leadership and they will talk about leadership, but we actually mean fundamentally different things when we talk about it. And I think it does lead to misunderstandings, because I think, for example...
Well, the right wing, and kind of particularly, I mean, if Urquhart even troubled himself with thinking about unions, the critique there would be that leftist politics, kind of, especially in unionised form, gives people what they want rather than what they need, right? And that's kind of the whole Tory critique of, you know, being led by the unions, listening to the unions. Yeah,
and I'd counter that betrays the entire. I mean, that kind of neatly encapsulates the entire Tory pathology of it's for your own good, which I think is beautifully expressed in this show. I've got to say, I mean, perhaps never more elegantly done than in this serialization. And I think, yeah, I mean, to me, it's interesting how the show kind of, even though it's written by, or at least the source material is written by a Tory, it certainly has a very profound unease with the implications of that idea. So yeah, fascinating stuff.
Anyway, but before that, I actually just wanted to start on a fairly frivolous note, but one that I think I saw on Twitter that you'd been engaging with. Did you watch the Snyder Cut?
You know what? Honestly, I'm half an hour in. So my plan was basically to watch the Snyder Cut in 15-minute intervals on my lunch breaks, because 50 minutes is all I've been managing to squeeze. Right. For a lunch break for various reasons. Yeah. And hilariously, since I did that, I've actually, this is how insane it's gotten, I actually only managed 2 days where I've been able to find 15 minutes to sit and watch it. Right. So yeah. I'm literally half an hour in. But that's okay, because I'm only half an hour in, nothing's really happened yet. So that's kind of okay.
Well, get used to that feeling.
I can't quite, I mean, so far, half an hour in, I will grant you, it doesn't quite, for me, have the car crash quality of Batman vs Superman, which is a movie I am kind of fascinated by how awful that film is. Like, genuinely, for real, like, because I've watched it more than once, and I really shouldn't, because I don't think it functions narratively, actually. I think it's broken on a storytelling level, that film, really. And yet, something about it does compel me to want to put it back on again, and just it is partly a kind of theatrical disbelief that it happened, but it's also, there is a genuine, for me, I kind of feel this way a bit about Man of Steel as well, though I've only seen it once, but there is a particular fascination for me with Batman versus Superman, in the sense of, like, how did that much money and effort and time and artistic, you know, energy get invested in something this broken? It is kind of fascinating, because it does have an energy to it, and it clearly had a budget, and and it is perplexing to me. I have to be honest, it's perplexing to me. And so far, Justice League doesn't seem to be in that kind of quite in that mode. But it just, but I'm half an hour in and nothing's happened. So there's that, you know.
Well, you're probably only about, you know, because it's split into these kind of segments with chapter titles and stuff like that. You're probably only to like 2 of the 8 of those, or 2 of the 10 of those, or however many there are. So
I'm only halfway through the whatever it is Batman. I can't remember what it was, but yeah, it's not. Yeah. I've had the
with a Gower style Batman or whatever the hell it's called. Something pretentious like that.
Yeah, I had no idea. There was the whole thing with Aquaman and Bruce Wayne at the start, which didn't. I mean, admittedly, I haven't seen the Aquaman movie, so that didn't do much for me. And then we had I've seen the Wonder Woman, but that, I mean, the bit where she uses the lasso of truth and the guy says, you know, we're a reactionary terrorist movement who want to. I can't even remember what he says because it's so stupid.
Yeah,
and it is so stupid, and I my thing is, like, the thing about fanatics, right? And I say this as someone who I'm aware that there are, you know, that there are less charitable people who might consider my politics to be quite radical in some ways, right? I'm aware of that. You know,
they definitely exist. Yeah,
I'm on a spectrum, and not everyone would be happy with where I am on that spectrum. I own that. That's fine. Like, but no one. The whole point of fanaticism is that you really believe what you're doing. So you just even if you're compelled to tell the truth, then you're compelled to tell. By the way, that particular compulsion is something I'm fascinated by. I've written a whole novella about what happens if you're forced to tell the truth and you can't lie. I think it's a really powerful concept, and there's a lot of fun to be had with it. In terms of what it can tell you about society and how it's structured and how it works. And once you start thinking about how much of what we do is based on our ability to lie, it's really, really, really fascinating. And I say that without moral judgment, just to be crystal clear. But the point is, like, fanatics, they it's not that you might not know he's in the area, but you just wouldn't say it in that way, you know.
I know it's meant to be a throwaway joke, but I do quite like the idea of the lasso of truth being used to tell stories that are a variant on the Mitchell and Webb sketch, Are We the Bad Guys?
The bad guys.
That's quite cool, you know.
Well, if they'd landed the gag that way, then I'd have more time for it. But I don't know. It just felt very. And then, you know, and the sequence where she you know, blocks every single bullet from the machine gun is fine. But yeah, I just I don't know. It's like I say, it didn't interestingly. It didn't have the car crash compulsion, as I say. It may be because it's slower. I mean, that's the interesting thing about Batman versus Superman is it's quite. I think it's actually quite frenetically paced. It feels like quite a lot's happening, although none of it feels connected to anything else that's happening. So it's quite, you know, it's not in any sense coherent, but it does have a certain breathless quality to it. Which this doesn't so far.
I mean, my main thing with Batman versus... Well, no, I had loads of things with Batman versus Superman. I mean, to be honest, I didn't go in expecting to like Batman versus Superman very much, but I kind of... I disliked it more than I thought I would, or thought it was more of a mess than I thought it would be. One thing I was annoyed about on a plot level with Batman versus Superman, and I know this is reheating old coals that... This is what annoys me about this whole thing, really, culturally, is like we should have stopped talking about all of this a long time ago. You know? But no, just putting Bruce Wayne and Lex Luthor in a live-action narrative together, I think for the first time, or certainly in a movie, and just not making much of the fact that they are two kind of rich maniacs, basically. No, and, you know, may have gone to school together and things like that. You know, it's cool, kind of.
Yeah, it's a good point actually, because it's one of my kind of. I remember I was explaining to someone I was trying to explain to someone the plot of because I was really into the Batman comics in the 90s and early noughties, so that for about a 10-year period there. I wasn't buying them monthly. I wasn't quite that bad, but I was buying the trade collections as they came out, and there were a lot of them. So I read through the Nightfall story, you know, where Bane breaks Bruce Wayne's spine and puts him in a wheelchair, and someone takes over, and they turn out to not be very good at it. And then I read Cataclysm, where there's an earthquake in Gotham. And I remember talking to someone through the plot of No Man's Land, saying, like, so what happens is, after the earthquake, the federal government decides that that it's too expensive to rebuild Gotham, so they just decide to close Gotham. And they just obviously they let everyone out of the asylum first, because, you know, and then basically they just say, if you stay in Gotham after this time, you're on your own. It's no man's land. It doesn't exist. And I remembered as I was telling them that, of course, the reason that happens is because Lex Luthor is the president of the United States in the DC
right.
universe, and it's his initiative. And I thought, that's so... And it's funny you saying that. As soon as you sort of said that, I immediately clicked on, like, now that would have been cool, man. That would have been a really fun story, you know?
Yeah. Well, I like the idea of, because everyone of kind of our political leaning and other variants on it, make fun of the West Wing, and quite rightly so. I like the idea of a West Wing where Lex Luthor is president for episode 1, and it's actually just following it. It's not like House of Cards or anything. It's not like following a leader through pitfalls and like slumps and everything. He is just president for the entire series, and there's no challenge to it. It's just seeing how his administration works.
That would be funny, especially if, as in the West Wing, you were focused, as you say, entirely on the kind of poor sods whose job is to try and keep the wheels on the wagon. That would just be hilarious.
But if they were all DC villains as well.
Oh, I see. Oh, right. So you'd have like, what? Yeah, Calendar Man booking the events. And
I think I'm just describing the administration we just went through, actually.
I was going to say, I don't know. Well, I remember when I was describing the plot of No Man's Land, someone was saying, although looking at, I think it was in 2016 or 2017, and thinking like, I mean, is it better or worse the fact that Luthor would have been at least competent? I mean, I don't, evil genius as opposed to just evil,
Yeah. Well, the Lex Luthor thing came up a little bit. I think I did an episode of this podcast where we were talking about the immediate aftermath of the Capitol riots and stuff, and I couldn't help but I spliced in a clip from the DC animated universe, one of the Justice League animated episodes where they are taking on, it's the one where they show this, you end up with this alternate universe where the Justice League are quote unquote evil, but the inciting thing is that in their universe Lex Luthor becomes president, and Superman, rather than settle for that, he kills him, and that's what happened. So I played that just before we talked about the Capitol riots at length, so the old DC nerd in me couldn't help it,
Yeah. No, that is nice. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, yeah, it's... Now, that's a weird thing. The Capitol riots already feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? And yet, what an incredible moment of history we just lived through there, right?
Oh, well, we've just lived... I mean, it's kind of... I was hinting at this when I said it felt like it'd been a long, long time since I'd seen you, but I mean, we just lived through a really, really tough, long few months, didn't we?
Yeah.
On every level, really, like from the personal to the political and everything in between.
Yeah. It's been intense. It's been a roller coaster. It's been very challenging, and I mean, I don't know, man. The Capitol. It's to me, the interesting thing about that has been watching. I remember someone, and I can't remember who it was. I want to say it was one of those. There's a few of those kind of more centre-right US commentators who were never Trumpers, and they were critical of the administration throughout, and is it David Frum, I think, is one of them? It might have been him, or it might have been someone else, but one of those commentators was asked, how do you think, and I think it was either just before or just after the riots, I think maybe just after, like, how do you think the Republicans are going to pivot away from Trump, assuming that's what they realise they have to do now? It must have been after the riots, actually, because that's the only time it would have made sense to ask the question. How, what do you envisage the Republican pivot's going to look like? And he just said, very calmly, he just said, none of it ever happened. You will be amazed how much none of it ever happened. And it does seem to be...
Especially the bits on film and the bits that led to court cases and deaths.
But the amnesia is total. And they plough on like the Republican Party's always been just the Republican Party. Oh, we're just the shucks party of small government and religious freedom as long as you're a Christian, and they just bamble on like they didn't just that their president didn't just instigate a fascist coup, and then they didn't just vote to let him off.
Well, Mitch McConnell managed to, as with most of these things, he managed to walk that line at the highest level in both senses, didn't he? Because he really did the mild vanilla condemnatory thing at the same time as not just doing nothing about it, but actively conspiring in doing nothing about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how much memoirs and stuff will reveal. Not his, obviously they'll be completely unreliable, but people around him might reveal in the future how close he was to actually coming down harder on Trump after the Capitol riots. If Mitch McConnell was genuinely vacillating or not.
I mean, the trick that he pulls, and I'm trying to remember who else it was. I think it was a trick I remember seeing Paul Ryan do back when Paul Ryan was still a political figure that anyone needed to care about. But there's this odd triangulation where they'll deliver these quite condemnatory speeches, and McConnell did a couple of those on the floor of the Senate, and they were powerful speeches, taken in isolation, and you read them and you think, oh, you listen to them and you think, yeah, okay, that sounds like somebody's had enough of this shit. But then but then you look at the actual actions, and the actions were refused to allow the impeachment even to be handed over to the Senate until after the changing of the guard, and then say, oh well, he's no longer in office, so constitutionally we shouldn't be doing this. It's like, well, dude, that's only because you refused to have the trial when, and it's so kind of, for me, it's illustrative really of the kind of Republican disease at the moment in terms of like just the divorce from reality. But it does say, I think, some quite scary things about human psychology, that clearly this works on enough Republican voters for whatever reason. Enough of them believe it, and enough of the rest allow themselves to believe it. Because I cannot believe, I think with some of this, I think that's the bit that I find psychological, as a writer, as someone interested in human nature, I find it psychologically fascinating, the doublethink that has to be going on in a lot of people's minds in that kind of far right space, in terms of both simultaneously believing and not believing, simultaneously understanding and not understanding. And I am really genuinely fascinated by that.
Well, and rationalizing decisions that you feel genuinely conflicted about as well, right? Because there'll be quite a lot of Republicans who were, either on board with Trump or tentatively on board with him, or pragmatically on board with him for the purposes of the election they just voted in, and then the Capitol riots will have happened, and a lot of them will have felt deeply embarrassed and scared about that. But some of them will have turned away from him for good, that it will have done its job in that sense. But some of them will have doubled down because they are embarrassed and scared by what it means, and they can't fully grapple with that,
Yeah, there's probably that as well. I mean, I think one of the things this conversation is making me realise is that it's always a mistake to ascribe a single motive to a group of people and a group of actors, because you're right, there's going to be a lot of different psychological responses. Because you're absolutely right, it did cost him support. I mean, I can't remember if it was a 4 or a 5 point dip, but it happened and it was permanent. And that, again, that's simultaneously kind of impressive and horrifying, right? There's this thing about like, one of part of you is like, wow, his numbers basically didn't move at all for 4 years, no matter how much heinous shit he did. But even then, it cost him another 5% of the electorate who were just like, well, I can't deal with you anymore. And then part of you is like, only 5%? Like, really? That's all the damage it did. Like inciting insurrection, attempting to incite a fascist coup. 5%. Yeah.
And it was far less deniable. I mean, this again, talk about reheating year-old films, but reheating coups. It was a far less plausibly deniable coup attempt than I thought it might be. I didn't expect him to be in the same city when things like that went down, for example. I expected him to be tweeting from Mar-a-Lago or whatever. I didn't see that he would practically be at the head of the line.
Yeah, I think that's...
Well, it's the back of the line. Sorry,
the very back of the line. It's like, you go that way, I'll be right there with you. Yeah, and then bugger off. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think if I'd seen good enough odds, I might have put down a small wager on him. Actually disappearing off to a non-extradition country before inauguration day. I thought there was a non-trivial chance that he would do that, and he still might. I mean, the interesting thing is that obviously what's gone quiet now are the huge number of legal cases that he's got outstanding against him. I'm thinking particularly of the stuff in New York around his finances, but there's a ton of stuff behind that. And again, the courts are slowly but surely handing down judgments to make it clear that even if he had protected status at one point, he certainly doesn't now, and his tax returns are gonna, he's forced to hand them over and things like that. And I'll be very interested to see how that plays out, because I'm increasingly, it's difficult when you're in the eye of the storm of it. There's so much information flying around and it's so baffling. It is hard to keep track of it all. But I think what it's easy to lose sight of is that this guy is, allegedly. But if you look at the evidence of his history, fundamentally the time and place in which he was engaged in being a property tycoon, we know based on what's public record that some of the people he interacted with were, to put it mildly, deeply unsavoury characters, and we know he behaved in unsavoury ways because there's court cases against him ruling that, and we know all the stuff he did with his contractors. I find it vanishingly unlikely that there won't be something prosecutable in there somewhere. And it's you know, I mean, we have to obviously, and I have to be careful about what I say because like neither of us. I mean, they can sue us for our overdrafts, can't they? But you know what I mean. Like we don't want to be dealing with that. But it was easy to lose sight of that in the kind of, I think, in the theatre of it, of what he became. But he's not the president anymore. He's just another failed property mogul and failed TV personality and one-term ex-president.
Yeah. And
the law does absolutely apply to those people. In a way, it doesn't for presidents.
I suppose the crucial thing is he's basically going to be around now in order to, long enough to regrow the heads of the Hydra for the 2022 elections, really, isn't he? And by that, I don't mean that conspiratorially, just he is clearly overtly trying to influence the next generation of Republican politicians and supercharge those who please him, and you know.
Yeah.
So the next election is already going to be hugely shaped by him, you know.
Yeah, and the fascinating question to me is the degree to which the Republican Party has become the Trump Party, and I think that is actually still an open question. I don't think we know, because I think we haven't had a post-Trump election yet. And as you say, 2022 is going to be fascinating because every senator that voted to convict that isn't retiring is going to have someone primary them on the right. I mean, let's take that to the bank, right? Now that person might not win, but they might. There were motions of censure against some of those senators from their state parties, state Republican parties. Is the Republican Party going to continue a march to Trumpification? That's a really fascinating question to which I make no prediction at all, and I don't think anybody else does know either. It's interesting to me that it's worth bearing in mind that when he became leader, of course, I don't think he ever actually won an outright majority of Republican support. I think he won a plurality, but remember he was running against like 16 people. I mean, it was the clown car convention, wasn't it? It was absurd, and part of his success came down to the fact that there wasn't a single unity candidate against him. Like the establishment Republican Party just did not get its act together, because I think, like everyone else, they thought this guy can't possibly win. But I think what I'm really interested in, as you say, is 2022, and what I'm really, really interested in as a subset of that is what the hell happens with Republican candidate selection, because that's going to be the real clue as to what's going on with the Republican Party. You know, are they going to go back to merely being a party of vicious neo-reaction, or are they going full fash?
Did you see Sarah Palin is rumored to be making a return in Alaska? I think she's being shimmied into a Senate contest.
That's really interesting, because I don't know any of the details of it at all, but my understanding is that there's something very interesting about the Alaskan Senate process. There's something about open lists, but I don't know the detail of it.
Oh, is that where you can kind of like end up with two Republicans fighting each other off in the final?
Yeah.
Not the final. That sounds ridiculous. But
in the runoff
in November.
Yeah, in the runoff. Yeah. I think so. Yeah, I think they've got an open list. But I know the phrase open list. I don't know what it means, so I have no idea what any of that. This is the problem with listening.
Let's just say things for a bit.
Look, this is the problem with listening to 538 when you're doing the ironing, right? You're like, it doesn't all go in, okay?
Yeah.
But there's some shenanigans around Alaska, which my memory of it is just whatever it is, it's procedural, but it does mean it's more wide open up there than it would be normally, and that. Yeah, of course, that makes it more interesting for all kinds of candidates. I mean, the context, I remember it was saying it actually meant that Democrats had a better shot than they have had in the past for some reason, but I don't know what that was. But yeah, Palin's interesting because she was, in retrospect, Palin was obviously such a precursor to Trump, wasn't she? She really did, set the tone.
Yeah, well, I suppose, she was the VP version of him, wasn't she? In the sense that she was endlessly mocked and ridiculed, but she did, make it out. Except she wasn't part of a winning ticket, I guess, is the thing there. The ridicule in that case overwhelmed them, or maybe the writing was just always on the wall, really.
I think you've got to. I think it's worth bearing in mind that one of the things about that particular brand of virulent far right politician is actually they do define winning differently, and Palin did win because she's a millionaire now. And she's never going to have to work again, and she's the darling of a particular circuit, and she, is a massively influential and popular figure. She won. She absolutely won. You know what I mean? And it's like, obviously I'm glad that John McCain wasn't.
Yeah. Well, and imagine Twitter had cropped up 2 years earlier as well, because Twitter in 2008, Twitter was only really, I think, a sort of niche. I remember there's a joke in the 2009 series of The Thick of It about Twitter, and it has to be explained to the audience, like what it is. all he has to explain what it is basically to Nicola, and it's still at that level where only really political obsessives and journalists have heard of it.
Right. That's so fascinating, isn't it? Because it's such. Twitter's a big. It's a stupid thing to say, but Twitter's actually not a non-trivial part of my life, to be honest. At this point, like, it's an incredible platform. And yeah, that's fascinating. Funnily enough, you reminded me of, because I'm doing the MCU rewatch at the moment with my kid, and there's a joke about MySpace in Iron Man. And I had to explain it to my daughter. She was like, I was like, okay, I am officially a million years old.
Like you're watching a Preston Sturges movie or something.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Drill down into your deep memory.
She was like, what's MySpace? And I'm like, it seemed important at the time, but now you
Let me show you a few screenshots. Don't scream. Don't scream. The aesthetic is unique,
Oh, my first band was on MySpace, man. That was how we were going to take over the world. Yeah, jeez.
So the Snyder Cut. No. I mean, honestly, I'll let you finish with it. Obviously, and the one thing actually I had remaining to say about it that tickled me was, so I was talking about those pretentious credit, like chapter titles things, and they come up on black. No spoilers, but they're all very solemn or pretentious or overwritten, or there's all that. But what I realised that about halfway through, I realised that what it was reminding me of was Monty Python's The Meaning of Life.
No.
Part 3, childbirth and things like that. It's like, because they're so reaching for meaning and stuff. And I was just like, and then that got me thinking, like, Monty Python's Justice League, if they'd made it, like I was thinking of John Cleese as like, a frustrated Steppenwolf, who's trying to like.
That's good. Well, Daredevil's Catholic, right? So he'd do every sperm is sacred, obviously.
Sure. Yeah. We'll work them all in,
Although he's MCU, so that doesn't work. Yeah, well, we'll figure it out. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. But I mean, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous enough. I mean, I find it, I was saying, like, we've wasted too much time over the last decade arguing about, what makes a good Superman and Batman movie and all that kind of stuff. I found myself having to check myself a few years ago, because what I really liked, so this is a whole other topic for some other time, but I really liked Superman Returns, the one that came out in 2006.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of that. And I found myself on Facebook about 3 years ago. I have a mate who's a really big Man of Steel fan. Yeah,
right.
He likes the Zack Snyder Man of Steel. I really like Superman Returns, and we were talking about it, and then the conversation got a bit spiky, and it wasn't just him, it was me a bit. We were getting a bit spiky with each other, and we were just talking about the film, and we talked about daft stuff like, is it good to show Krypton or not in a Superman movie, or for example, which is interesting. But we were getting a bit like shirty with each other. We were getting a bit, it's a bit like a City versus United debate or something like that. And I was like, and like after a half an hour of that, I was like, what am I doing? Like, I feel like I like to think that I'm above this stuff, most people do. And I was like, I'm getting a bit like partisan, and I'm not even getting partisan about DC versus Marvel. I'm getting partisan about like a DC movie versus another DC movie.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I do think genuinely the biggest problem that the DC cinematic universe has got, the Marvel didn't, is most of the Marvel ones, they're doing it for the first time, or the first time in 40 years, and it's certainly the first time most of it's been done well.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think anyone's beaten Christopher Reeve's Clark Kent. I think that is and the thing is about superhero movies as well, bear that in mind, it's the alter ego that you're actually casting for. That's the important bit, because anyone can wear the suit and look good in it. But Reeves' Clark Kent is still the definitive article for me, all these years later. And the way Clark would turn into Superman, the way you've seen the GIF, I'm sure, where his whole physical demeanor just transforms as he takes the glasses. Like, his shoulders go up, and it's just extraordinary performance. And it's the kind of thing that, I mean, obviously part of that is I saw it as a kid, and you imprint as a kid, on the stuff, and I'm not blind to that. But even so, I mean, I have gone back and watched those movies sort of relatively recently with adult eyes, and it just kicks the shit out of anything that happened since. And actually, I mean, I don't mind Superman Returns at all. I'm quite fond of it, but the reason I'm fond of it, I think, is because it's set up as a sequel to those films, and it still ties in with. It feels like it's a loving homage to that version of the universe, which I really like. And I think with Batman, I mean, as much as I have spent several hours on mic ripping apart the many issues with the Nolan Batman movies, they're still really kick-ass movies. I mean, they just are. They're deeply flawed, but they're also really, really good superhero movies. And if you're going to take on Batman, well, that's what you got to top. And if you want to take on Joker, you got to top Ledger. I mean,
Well, part of my it's funny you talk about watching superhero movies with your kid, actually, because one of the reasons Superman Returns is so sentimental to me is it's the last film I saw at the cinema with my dad, because my dad passed away in the late noughties, and he was actually quite ill when we saw it,
right?
And it was kind of, I mean, not only is that movie saturated with, father to son and then the son to the next son kind of stuff, but also it deals with a lot of kind of themes of strength and weakness, and my dad was battered by chemo at that point and all that sort of stuff. So it was a lot, But I think, I mean, that's not the only level on which I have to defend the film. It's obviously why it means a lot, but it's I do also really, really like it for other reasons. But
no, I think it's a really decent bit of cinema, and again, I think because for me, I think what it does is, I mean, I fundamentally don't like Snyder's version. I don't like his vision of Superman at all. I just don't like it. And I don't. There's nothing against Carvel, who I think's a fine performer. Actually, I think he's a decent actor, but there's nothing he can do with the scripts he's given. That is a vision of Superman that I just don't kind of recognise. And I just think I think Superman is the last place in the world you want cynicism. Fundamentally, to me, Batman is where you want cynicism because that's what he's for. Superman is that you don't. It's wrong. It breaks the balance of the character. It breaks the core identity of what that character is, to me anyway. Yeah,
I don't disagree, but I suppose you've got an interesting question there about how much you're allowed to confront Superman with cynicism, right? Because like we were talking about Lex Luthor before, he's always a very cynical character and he's an antagonist, so like how much are you allowed to sort of dip Superman in a world that is cynical, and
I don't know. That I think you can do. That I think you should do. I think most of the good Superman stories are about exactly that. But you can't get to the point where the cynicism overwhelms Superman. You can't get to the point where the cynicism infects him. That's the point. I mean, look, Superman 3 is my favourite of the Reeve movies, and the reason for that is because it does that entire plot line. It has him get corrupted by the bizarro kryptonite, right? The dodgy kryptonite that they make and manufacture, and you end up with a punch up between evil, selfish Superman and Clark Kent, and it's a mind-bendingly fantastic piece of cinema. It's absolutely, and what I love about it is like I don't know how many times I've seen it now. I still have no clue to what degree any of it's real, and to what degree it's just a representation of what is going on in Superman's head. And I don't care. It's brilliant. Yeah. But the point is that's a story about cynicism in part. That's about Superman getting corrupted and becoming someone who is selfish rather than selfless. But firstly, it's explored in a very particular way, and secondly, it resolves the right way. And the trouble with the Snyder version is that it's like, no, this is the price we pay when gods walk among us. It's come on, man.
Anyway, so to play the king, you know what? Firstly,
seamless segue.
Francis Urquhart's triumphant return as Prime Minister leads to his greatest challenge:
a new king, a new age of hope and peace and spiritual growth.
But reminders of the past still haunt the present.
I'll bring the lot of them down if I have to.
Ian Richardson stars in To Play the King, beginning Sunday at 9:05 on BBC One.
Welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 29. Welcome everyone. This is I'd like to welcome back for the second time to the show, Kit Power. How are you doing?
Yes, I just overjoyed to be here. Yeah, no, good to be here. How are you doing? You all right?
Yeah, I'm all right. Fine. Yeah, I've just had a little warm-up chat, which you'll probably before you hear this bit. I've gathered Kit today to talk about several things, but the main meat of the adventure is to continue the exploration of the BBC TV series, that leads from House of Cards in 1990, which we talked about. I think it was episode 21. I'll check that, but it was certainly an episode just before the end of 2020. And what I'm going to do for a lot of people listening to this episode is, if you're already in the sort of niche bracket of people who care enough about the British version of House of Cards to listen to these at all, probably go back and listen to that one. Really, I mean, for your own good. Not just because it's more well-known piece of work than its two sequel series, and to be honest, you might be here for that, really, if you're here for it at all. But also because in that episode, me and Kit talked quite a bit about our sort of our background with sort of seeing the show for the first time, and our sort of kind of like our basic political backgrounds and attitudes towards the show and to the central character and things like that. And although we're obviously going to touch on quite a lot of that again, and afresh in terms of to play the king, you might get some of the basic background there. And the reason I say that is because I'm going to, rather than asking Kit kind of all the predictable questions about when he first saw this, and kind of start talking through some of the more basic stuff like that, I thought I'd attack it from another way because of the subject matter of the second series, which is To Play the King, which originally aired in 1993. So we'll go more in depth on various aspects of it in a bit. But firstly, Kit, I was just going to talk to you a little bit about the monarchy in general.
Right.
Small topic. So because I've got some stuff to say as well, but like, sure. So as a kid, when you were, particularly in those sort of early stages of childhood, where I guess up to like about the age of sort of 8, 9, I guess, when you're sort of first taking very basic concepts about the world and about the country you live in on board, and you're getting some of it from your parents and some from other people's parents maybe, and teachers and kids. Do you remember? What your thoughts about the monarchy were, about us having one, and about the history of it, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, it's a great question. I think I kind of do. For me, it's very bound up in my early kind of experiences with Christianity, I think I'd have to say. I think the two are kind of inextricably linked in my mind, because neither of my parents are, I wouldn't describe as religious, I don't think. My father's a pretty staunch atheist, I'd say. He's right on enough politically that he's not fallen into the kind of some of the more egregious new atheist traps, but he did fall into a couple of them. And he certainly, I think he would probably still describe himself as an admirer of, say, Dawkins and certainly Christopher Hitchens pre-Iraq anyway. So pretty robust atheist. And my mum, although not religious, was certainly, I think I'd have to say, explored various kind of spiritual paths throughout my childhood. I'm trying to think when I was little. I mean, she was really into second wave feminism when I was little. I was at Greenham Common Peace Camp with her, and we were protesting the bomb and what have you. But there was always a spiritual dimension to it for her, and a kind of generic new agey paganism, druidry, a brief flirtation with kind of Native American spirituality as well, and probably a kind of slightly inappropriate, kind of appropriatingly way, but well-meaning.
Yeah, sure.
But she did kind of, funny enough, she kind of, 15 years before people started really talking about cultural appropriation, she did kind of find her own way to be like, actually, this feels a bit squicky, I'm going to stop doing this. Yeah, so
I had little Buddhist statues all around my bedroom when I was a teenager, and didn't really know anything about it.
Hey, look, if you can't do dumb shit when you're a teenager, what even is the point of life? But anyway, so that was the background. So the point is no Christianity, right? That's the point. No church, no Bible, none of that. But my schools were. Every school I went to was a C of E school. So because my teachers told me about it, I believed it. So I was a very kind of uncritical, Christian as a young child, as a kind of 5, 6, 7-year-old, and that the bubble only really burst for me when I finally plucked up the courage to ask my father about it, and he was like, "No, I don't believe in that." And I spent about 48 hours in terror, thinking, "Oh my god, my dad's going to hell." And then after that, I was like, bollocks, is he? And that
so you shook it off quite easily after a sort of dry out period.
Yeah, it was 48 hours. I think maybe 24. Like, it didn't take long for me to be like, "No, that's nonsense." And if that's nonsense, it's probably all nonsense. But I think probably with the monarchy, it's probably the same thing. So obviously, neither of my parents would. I mean, neither of them would describe themselves as monarchists. I think, so again, my mum's line would be like, we should have burned down a palace 100 years ago, probably. Dad's line would probably be, it's complete... I think, well, no, I know, I'm just saying probably, we've spoken about it. My dad's line is, it's, intellectually and morally it's indefensible. It just so happens this particular version kind of works, so let's just leave it alone. I mean, that's...
This particular compromise.
Yeah, and also this particular monarch. I mean, his thing is like Elizabeth's II is just kind of incredible, and that's a view.
It's a very popular view.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah,
and so so that's the. But like, I think I just had a very kind of unconscious, like, certainly not examined, not thought through. But yeah, I think I probably just kind of went, yeah, we got a queen. That's cool. That's kind of, and it probably did feel in some nebulous way part of Britishness or Englishness to the extent that I thought about that as a concept at all, which wasn't very much obviously.
Did you read much about that? Because I'm getting into my own thing here, but like, did you read much about the monarchy when you were a kid, or maybe even an adolescent? Did you like, were you much into that history, or like, or into fictionalized versions of it even? Or
I mean, so obviously there were fairy tales, and that was not to be ignored, because they're full of kings and queens, and I enjoyed fairy tales. I had a history teacher in the last year of junior school, primary school, who was had a seismic influence on me for a number of reasons. He's the guy who did that. I wrote a piece for Ginger Nuts about being taught about the slave trade. That was him. He delighted in terrifying us with tales of history. And I mean, his version of history was a horror story from start to finish, and it made a huge impact on my young mind. So yeah, not so much kings and queens and dates, but executions and tortures and shit like that. Yeah, man.
Yeah,
a lot of that. I mean,
quite a lot of overlap there, of course, as well. If you're reading about the history of the monarchy.
Yeah, but stuff about, like, I mean, he delighted in talking to us about. I mean, all kinds of stuff. I mean, obviously there's all the kind of medieval stuff about, like, prove you're innocent by plunging your hand into the boiling water and pulling out the stone, and if it doesn't go pussy, then I guess you didn't steal the horse, and we're not gonna have to cut your hand off. But like, but he did go into so the monarchy side of that would be like just the stuff that kings and queens would do to each other, and that they do to people who got them wrong. So there was that sense of, like, kind of viciousness and power. Yeah, definitely, and certainly as a teenager when I saw Braveheart, I absorbed that film like it was. I mean, like, that and JFK are competing in my head for the two bits of propaganda I fell for the most completely. Like, I completely, like, I remember Braveheart. I remember just being in tears of rage at the end of Braveheart, like, genuinely for real, moved. Like, it was painful to watch, and I couldn't stop watching it. Like, I was obsessed with that film. But yeah, so that's my background. So I didn't. I could not fairly describe myself as having studied the history in any great detail, but I certainly was, and I was interested in the Civil War. So I did do a little bit of reading as a teenager around the Civil War, just because, like, it kind of blew my mind when I found out we'd actually executed a king. That kind of was a trip to me. Yeah. A king called Charles, funnily enough, which may or may not become relevant to the conversation as we go forward. But yeah, that was astonishing, and it's interesting how I think one of the things that made me realise was the kind of gaps in how we're taught history, actually, because I do remember thinking about that and being like, well, hang on though, so the story goes, we killed the king because he was a tyrant, and then democracy and everything's fine again, but we've still got a monarch. So yeah, I think that's a very fundamental part of the British psyche when it comes to thinking about power in the monarchy, actually, is that we're kind of a country who, I was talking before about sort of addiction metaphors and stuff. We're kind of a country who dried out and then went back to the habit. And that, for anyone who's dealt with any kind of addiction stuff, they know that the kind of headspace that puts you in, at least short term, and probably in terms of centuries, we're still talking short term, really, aren't we? Yeah. I think it's a very odd country that we live in, and I think partly what you might call the briefly successful English Revolution, if you call it that, is a huge part of that. I was, because previously on this podcast we've talked a bit. Me and my brother talked a bit about the first series of Blackadder. And I took that on at a very early age, and obviously that, alongside, horrible histories, books, and what little you pick up of Shakespeare as a kid and stuff like that. Blackadder's a crash course in kind of a condensed highlight history of the monarchy, and obviously it will never fail to piss off Michael Gove, apparently. It delights in presenting most monarchs as, venal and stupid and manipulative and cruel and dangerous, and part of the reason I vibed with the first series of Blackadder so much was one of my teachers at primary school actually was what I believe is called a Ricardian, so a revisionist about Richard III actually being quite a nice man. Yeah, God, they're a fascinating bunch.
Yeah, they really are, and she imparted that kind of stuff to me about the same time I saw Blackadder, so I was like, all right, this has weird attempts to do that at the same time as I've just been introduced to this concept. But I was a proper obsessive, so I had, and I don't mean, so by that I don't mean I was a monarchist, I mean, and I'll try and work out if I ever was after this. But sure. I was really into it. I was really into the history of it. I was able to recite all the kings in order from William I at quite an early age, and I had this is ridiculous, but I had almost posters of them up on my wall, kind of in order as well.
Oh, so really cool.
Going around the room and stuff like that. Proper nutcase stuff, but I like reading about them, and I had kind of fictionalized, young, I guess we'd now call them young adult novels that I think I inherited from my mum, which are about the young Elizabeth I and the young Mary Queen of Scots. So I learnt some, for English kids, some fairly esoteric history, and I also got quite interested in the Civil War, or like, a condensed version of it. I remember going to like the Palace of Whitehall when I was a kid, and knowing enough about it to appreciate the import of it, and,
right.
And similarly with the Tower of London, actually, which is a whole other thing. But I really, it's so this is let's graze to play the king. We'll kind of dive right in a sec. But I've got the novel here, which I was having another look at today, and the book of To Play the King has a sequence near the beginning where the king that you're introduced... Yeah, you know what I'm talking about, don't you?
I've read it. I've read the intro. I haven't read the whole book, but yes, I'm glad you... Yeah, go on.
Yeah, where the king, who obviously features in the TV show as well, awakes basically from a sort of nightmare dream, doesn't he? Where he kind of is Charles the First, or he's kind of inhabiting that role or standing in for him, and he's kind of haunted by it. And I was just like... I mean, I think that book's a real train wreck in most respects.
Yeah.
But I was reading that, I was like, that would have been too much if they put it on screen. But I don't know. I mean, it might if they'd just gone full Gonzo,
I love it because to me, I don't think I even finished the book. I think it was bad enough that I abandoned it. But it's a brilliant opening, I think, genuinely, because for me, my read of it was. This may say something about my own kind of upbringing in terms of matters of spirituality and religion, but I absolutely read it as the idea was that it was kind of like a past life memory. I absolutely read it as what the writer thought was, no, this stuff is encoded in the DNA of the royal family, and this guy's having...
I think in the book it's meant to be.
Yeah. This is him having it wasn't a dream, it was an authentic past life flashback to being Charles I and being executed. And I mean, the implications of that, given the wider narrative, are staggering, because the king, certainly in the TV shows, meant to be the good guy, right? But if your historical identification figure is Charles I, I'm really sorry to tell you, you are not the good. Fascinating.
I have a really interesting sort of tangent to that, because I went to like a few people have been on this podcast. I went to St Andrews University in 2005 to 9. That's when I was there. And as you may be aware, a famous student of St Andrews University in the noughties was Prince William. Okay. So he went there just before I did. So basically he graduated and then I got there. So there was no overlap at all. Right. But I made some friends who were in the year above me at university. So they actually had, not interacted with him, putting a bit strongly, but they were on campus at the same time as him. And they knew a little bit about his kind of study, like study choices and things like that. And apparently when he was doing sort of sub-honours courses, in the first couple of years at St Andrews, he was doing philosophy and political philosophy. So these are some of the courses that I then went on to do. And I know that those courses include stuff about, Hobbes and Locke and stuff, thought from around the English Civil War, and about the divine right of kings, and about the, how right that is and how total that should be, and about what curb should be on it. And I was just thinking, like, if you were in Prince William's tutorial group and the tutor was like, so what do you think of Hobbes's defence of absolute monarchy? And you're not even if you're William, but if you're the guy sat next to him, you're just like, well, I think some update, some tweaks, maybe, like, to be, sir. I would have been. I like to think I would have been outspoken in that tutorial, but I can't. I'll never know.
Let us never be tested in that way. Who knows? I mean, that's what a spot to be in. That's really that's really fascinating. I mean, to be fair, imagine being a lecturer. That's not an easy gig, is it?
Yeah, I bet some of them enjoyed it though. But like he,
probably.
For all we know, Prince William might have enjoyed those years, being able to kind of. Go a bit academically wild and say things in tutorials that, you never... Although, I don't know, I guess you could never tell what stuff would get back to the tabloids and stuff as well, so you probably almost have to be on, in a sense, even in closed rooms.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? One of the reasons that we started having this conversation was me watching The Crown and live tweeting about it, and you made the point, actually, that where the season of The Crown I just watched ended was exactly where House of Cards starts, so it was actually a really nice kind of natural jump on point. But one of the things that show and especially To Play the King have in common is they do in different ways, but I think one of the things they both do is nail really, really well the kind of inhumanity of the office, of the superstructure of monarchy. And it's really interesting. Funnily enough, I'm just out of my rewatch of Black Panther, and that's a movie that has quite a lot to say about monarchy, and it's not all anywhere near complimentary. And one of the there's a great scene in that where he's, you know, spoilers for Black Panther if you haven't seen it, go and watch it, it's great. But there's, you know, when it looks like he's lost the throne for good and there's a new king and everyone hates him, but the moment where the warrior, the woman who leads the kind of royal brigade of warriors says, like, I'm loyal to the throne, I'm loyal to Wakanda, and she's, you know, she's in tears as she's saying it because her preferred king is no longer on the throne. But and it's that, you know, that essential split, that essential dichotomy that exists, that essential, you know, and it's an unsquarable circle really between the personal and this wider sense of loyalty, this wider sense of institution, this wider sense of this. And it, you know, the Crown does a good job of letting you, I mean, it feels like the monarchy itself, not the people, but the monarchy as a structure is just this kind of beast. You know, it's this kind of vampiric, soul-crushing, person-destroying edifice. You know, factory. I don't know what. And I think To Play the King kind of does talk about that. Actually, not as on the note. Although interestingly, To Play the King makes, I think, a similar point about the House of Commons. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah,
I think it makes a few points of that nature. It's funny. I think on that, maybe the prior one with you actually, Kit, I talked briefly about, you know, monarchy as like mob bosses, basically, you know, because I've been watching The Crown and The Sopranos. Yeah. But I think that comes from. I'm sure I mentioned this on our Blackadder episode, but it was basically because I read some historian when I was in my teens that said basically it was more helpful to think of medieval and pre-medieval monarchs as successful mob bosses. You know, like they gathered power to them, and they had people murdered, and they ambushed people with murder and exile and things like that. You know, and they can, you know, obviously they had favourites and protection rackets essentially, and you have to pay up the chain and all that kind of stuff. But I think that, you know, if you think about the modern monarchy in Britain as like the genteel, it's still a mob racket, right? It's just the genteel, all the fangs stripped away, but the core of it's still that. You know?
I mean, what my immediate, perhaps unworthy thought when you said that is like, it used to be a mob outfit, now it's a pyramid scheme, right? You know,
yes.
now it's Amway.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a pretty straight continuum there, I think.
Yeah. Which, you know, diminished, but still, you know, still generates a ton of money for the people at the top, right? It still keeps the pyramid, literally keeps the pyramid in shape.
You know, it's interesting you talk about bringing up the memory of the Crown again, obviously, because as you say, we commented that House of Cards, the first series, follows on chronologically from that. We'll talk more about Michael Kitchen and about his portrayal of the King in this, and maybe how it differs from the portrayal of Charles in the Crown. Not that was ever, you know, the point they were making or anything like that, but you know, but I just wanted to briefly, because you remember I was in private messages a few days ago, I was sort of teasing you with the fact that I thought I might have uncovered a dating controversy.
You did, yeah. Tell me.
Yeah. So it's not. I mean, it's not really a dating controversy. It's more of a kind of. I think we might be dealing with the House of Cards trilogy featuring two different irreconcilable realities, basically.
Okay.
So see what you think of this, because you know, this series, To Play the King,
yes,
as I say, that was on in '93. It starts with a brief to camera moment from Urquhart, which is very similar to the one about Thatcher at the start of the first series.
Yeah.
Where in that, you know, do you remember at the start of the first series, he's looking at a picture of Thatcher and he's talking about her, you know, her fall, which is, you know, as we commented in the first episode, it historically had just happened without all that. So in the start of To Play the King, he makes a similar reference to John Major, basically. He talks about the guy who was talking about, was it like, it was not the big society, but it was like, you know, the just society, the equal society,
classless society. You remember the chap who talked about the classless society?
Yeah, and then he says, like, he had to go, I'm afraid, or something like that. So you kind of, I think, I'm not taking this overly seriously, obviously, but I think what you might be dealing with there is two separate realities. One in which Urquhart ascended directly after Coleridge, but after Margaret Thatcher, and one in which he ascended in circumstances we have no idea about after John Major, because he sort of, to make that, it sort of breaks the reality of the show, doesn't it? Because he has to know about John Major making that speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably, I think the, if you like, the Doylean explanation is, as you say, it's probably the writers just being a little too clever for their own good. I think if you wanted a Holmesian explanation, if you wanted an in-fiction explanation for it, what you could say is that Coleridge was effectively a stand-in for Major, and it, you know, I could certainly imagine Coleridge saying something about a classless society. I can absolutely, because he was such a bland. I mean, it's, you know, I know we talked about it. I don't want to rehash the episode we did, but that conference where they're all like flailing around trying to figure out what a post-Thatcher Conservative Party looks like is hilarious. Because they're all just awful. None of them have anything to say at all, and I could absolutely imagine that Coleridge, funnily enough, is the best of a bad lot, which is what Major was seen by many in the Conservative Party as part, you know, after Thatcher. I could see that working.
Oh, you're right. I mean, you're right in the sense that someone would have said that at the same time because they were dealing with the same question.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's interesting actually because so on the chronology again, in rereading the book briefly today, or not the whole book, but skimming through it, I realised that there's an ambiguity in the series in terms of the gaps between House of Cards and To Play the King, and then between To Play the King and Final Cut, which we'll obviously get onto later. In the show, I think you're meant to get from implication that Urquhart has already won an election some years in the past, and this is him approaching his second election, and we'll get into why that might be. But in the book, it very explicitly is that he is still in the stages of taking over the premiership, and that he's still vulnerable, and he's inherited a party that's pretty shaky in the polls. Whereas and he's about to face his first general election. That's explicit in the book. But because the king almost like dares him to fight an election at all. The king actually says at one point that you're less legitimate than me because you haven't even done what you're meant to do. I've at least ascended. Whereas in the show, it's very much like Urquhart's he's kind of already in his imperial phase almost. Like he's kind of
explicitly so. I am becalmed, Elizabeth. I am secure. I have no enemies. Right. I mean, absolutely. And I think, I mean, my inference was that several years have passed between the events of the first show, House of Cards, and To Play the King. Absolutely. I didn't have it in my head that he'd fought another election, but of course he's just won. He's literally just won, hasn't he, at the end of House of Cards? So
my head canon of what happens after we leave him at the end of House of Cards is he has his first cabinet meeting. He's still a little bit underestimated because a lot of people are like, who's this guy? All that kind of stuff, and that lasts for about 5 minutes. and then what he does is him and Stamper basically pull a kind of what Johnson and Cummings did in 2019. Basically, they kind of get rid of an absolute purge. They get rid of half the cabinet ministers. I like to make that head kind of work. I like that none of the kind of big beasts from the first series come back in this one.
Yeah. Well, no, and I mean, look, that absolutely fits with what we know of Urquhart's character. I think that's a perfectly reasonable bit of headcanon, absolutely. And as you say, it's actually, I would say the fiction nods at that precisely by the fact that none of the supporting cast are there again, because they're all just like anyone that was the slightest threat. And I mean, it's hilarious, isn't it? Because that first cabinet meeting, my God, they're a collection of nobodies, aren't they? Apart from Urquhart, that's part of the beauty of that. The one guy who's in danger of having a personality is the guy who gets eviscerated by Stamper. It's wonderful stuff.
And you've got that awful female minister who's kind of, just like one of Urquhart's proper lapdogs, But she's so smug that she might as well be, really.
Yeah, absolutely. But she's so, and so obsequious, and so, wonderful stuff. Absolutely.
I like the detail. I think I was watching an episode the other day, and I like the bits in the House of Commons scenes in the show where you kind of catch the occasional person you've spotted around a cabinet table just behind him, in the government benches, kind of braying away, or, because they don't really make. This is probably with the exception of Stamper, this is probably the series where they make least deal out of the sort of internal politics of the Conservative Party, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's probably right. Like both House of Cards and the Final Cut in their own ways are both more about that.
Yeah, they're primary. I would say their primarily driving force in both of those is the Tory psychodrama, whereas you're right, To Play the King. The other thing I find fascinating about all three, but I think especially To Play the King, considering the storyline, is how almost entirely absent the opposition is. I find that absolutely fascinating. They're barely there, even in this story where they're obviously absolutely pivotal at a certain point. But the show goes out of its way to set this up as a power struggle between the king and the prime minister. It's not that they don't exist, but the leader of the opposition and the Liberal Democrats and the Tory wets are pawns. They're playing pieces on the board. They don't seem to have any agency at all. And I found that whole thing fascinating because it's articulated by Sarah, isn't it, in her first interview with Urquhart, where she says, well, you're in a commanding position because you've realised you don't have to please everybody. You're pleasing 42% of the population, the rest of them can go hang. I mean, she doesn't quite say it like that, but it's pretty close. And that that mentality, I mean, it's a pretty terrifying thing to say out loud in 2021 because, here we are again. But it's interesting because that kind of, I think that mentality kind of permeates especially this story in a really kind of interesting way, because it is, the opposition just don't kind of exist. I mean, he doesn't really have any opposition, does he, internal or external? That's kind of his problem at the start of the show.
Would you like to, because I want to come back to the opposition when we talk a bit later about the kind of possible narrative shortcomings of To Play the King when we get, I'm thinking particularly of the climax, really,
right.
Kind of the last episode. But I'm going to give you a choice here. This is like one of those, D&D style games where you have a forking path.
Yep.
So we'll get around to both of them. But do you want to talk about Michael Kitchen as the king first, or do you want to talk about Kitty Ulrich as Sarah first?
Oh, blimey. Let's talk about Kitty Ulrich. Let's talk about Sarah, I guess.
That's fantastic. I'm just going to get a glass of water.
Fine.
So I'll be back in 2 minutes, and then that is the path.
Okay.
All right.
You have
See
spoken.
You in a couple of minutes.
All right.
Thank you.
You're a real dinosaur, aren't you? You don't really belong on the new right at all.
I have an instinct for what the British people are prepared to stomach, Sarah. The forces that drive me come from centuries of history. This used to be a proud nation. It's becoming so again. I'm giving us back our pride, Sarah. Yes, of course it's a painful process, but it's worth it.
And I fiddle the polls for you to help you make it happen. How do you reconcile that?
I don't have to. I do whatever it takes. Thank you. Your car's waiting. Under the show, the struggle for power. Deep down below it all, deeper than honor, deeper than pride, deeper than lust, and deeper than love, is the getting of it all. The seizing and the holding on, the jaws locked, biting into power and hanging on. Biting and hanging on.
So, to talk to you about the role of Sarah Harding in To Play the King, she's played by the actress Kitty Aldridge. Did you? I think I read up about this years ago and completely forgot about it. But I don't know if you did any sort of biography, IMDb level Wikipedia reading about the actress. But did you read that she retired from acting kind of not too many years after To Play the King?
No.
And not for any tragic reasons or anything like that, just because she kind of didn't fancy it anymore, really. I think some of it, to be fair, might to do with the way in which getting roles as a female actor changes in your 30s and things like that. But she basically it's a huge dollop of do not feel sorry for this woman, because she became a very successful novelist. Like she's
oh, wow.
I think she's had at least 4 or 5 novels published, and they've been very critically acclaimed and sold well. And she's written short stories, and she's she's doing all right, basically.
Oh, good for her. That's great, absolutely.
Yeah, but didn't act that much after this. I think she was a fairly successful actress in her 20s and stuff, But so and doesn't seem to be that very easily findable online either. Oh, and she's married and has been for about, I think, 30 odd years to Mark Knopfler.
Wow. Okay, we need to have a conversation about burying the lead. Because
sorry. Yes.
Okay. What? Okay.
I got my Kit incentives modelled up there, didn't I?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
Blimey.
I thought as a serious novelist, you'd have that as a kind of, that'd be the in there. But,
I'm really, really happy for her. That's great, and that's fantastic. And I'm always happy for anyone who's become successful at writing, because it's a rough old gig. But married to Mark Knopfler for 30 years.
Yeah.
Blimey.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a Dire Straits fan myself, but that's above and beyond, isn't it? Blimey.
Yeah, it's pretty good. But I thought I'd mention that just as an in, because I think, obviously, when we spoke last year about House of Cards, we spent quite a fair amount of time, and justly so, talking about Susanna Harker as Mattie Storring. And obviously she, in the sense of footage being used, she sort of haunts the show from this point on, doesn't she?
Absolutely.
Including in To Play the King. But for that reason, the role of, you might say Urquhart's second woman, reductively, it was always going to be something we'd have to spend quite a fair bit of time talking about, isn't it? And I remember even on first viewings, kind of when I was watching this on DVD in the early noughties, being very fascinated by that and about the ways in which the character of Sarah is a bit of a rerun of Matty, and the many ways in which he isn't. So, do you have some initial thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. The thing that I find interesting is that actually it's the core of all three stories. It's almost like there's the political thriller, and then there's the strange socio-parasitic relationship that Francis strikes up with a woman, and that that's as integral to the story as anything else. And the three different versions of that story that we get across the three, wider narratives are themselves fascinating. Sarah Harding, on the surface at least, is a very, very different animal from Matty's story. I remember when we were talking about that, one of the things we were discussing was like, what even are Matty's politics? We weren't quite sure. And I think you said you could imagine her being almost sort of quite centrist or very sort of centre right. I thought she was probably like a Tory wet, but certainly Sarah Harding's a very different animal. I mean, I made a note on my view through. It's like at one point when she was saying some, grotesquely appalling thing about social workers at some dinner party.
She wants to privatise social work.
I was like, oh my god, she's a British Ann Coulter. She's a really bright, really articulate, woman who kind of specializes in saying really awful things with a smile, and
I suppose you could say that is her dinner party chat, isn't it? I mean, to be fair, that's her trying to make a mark on a circle she's just been invited into, sort of,
Yeah, but and I think, I mean, one of the open questions is how much she realizes she's auditioning for the part of Urquhart's mistress at that point, because clearly Elizabeth, Urquhart's wife, knows that she is. Clearly she's kind of, I mean, she's almost kind of pimping her out. It's really quite disturbing. I mean, we'll get to Elizabeth, I'm sure, because she's a really important part of this story. But yeah, I think for me it's interesting. What they've got in common is that they both want to get close to this man of power, and they want to understand what makes him tick, and they want to understand the power structures he's a part of. And that is, I mean, there's moments where you could play a game. Is it Sarah? Is it Matty? You probably wouldn't be able to tell when they're talking about that. When they're talking about I want to understand you, or I want to understand the world you operate in, or whatever. But I think that it's really interesting to me how, despite that similarity, Sarah is very different in the sense that she's a deeply political animal from the beginning. She has her own thoughts and views. Her politics are clearly very closely aligned with Francis's, although with the asterisk that they suddenly start to drift rather strangely in episode 4, which maybe we'll get to that, because it didn't quite work for me. I've got to be honest. The moment there was a moment in that where I was like, well, hang on, but you kind of agree with all of that, so what's your... Anyway, but maybe we'll get to...
I think there's a few shaky planks in episode 4. Not to say I don't hugely enjoy it, but...
Yeah. No, and I think that certainly was one of those moments for me where it was like... but I liked that. I liked that, and I liked that kind of. I like the energy that she brought to it. I mean, it's a great performance. I love how it's even less clear in this than it was in the first story who's seducing who, especially early on. It's really, really hard to tell. I love how Sarah kind of, unlike Matty, really does kind of fall into it. Sarah's very kind of forthright about, like, okay, so we're going to have an affair, and it's going to last as long as it lasts, and then we'll part as friends, and I like being married, you like being married. I thought that was really that was very different.
Although that's after at least one pivot already, though, isn't it? Because she does go in having to remind herself and him that she is. I think she says I'm very much in love with my husband. First proper chat.
I would never do anything to endanger my marriage. Yeah, but I think, I don't know. I mean, for me, that felt like that was the part of the dance. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I read that as step one in the dance. But I think, yeah. So I think she's a fascinating character. I like how it's a very different mode. Whereas with Matty was the one asking the questions, trying to make sense of it, and Urquhart was very much manipulating her for what he could get out of her as a journalist, actually. I mean, that's what she was inadvertently helping him with his kind of internal party politics and clearing the ground for his leadership run. This is very, very different. Urquhart's interest in her is her ability to generate push polls, which I found a bit like I don't know about you. I can't tell if this has aged badly or if it was just always a bit dodgy, but the way they talk about push polling as though it's this revelatory thing that can change. I was a bit like, really?
Well, and also if some people thought that in 1993, Urquhart wouldn't, right?
Well, I distinctly remember an episode of Yes Minister that skewered push polling, and that about I can get you, I can get you to answer this question one of two ways by the questions I ask you before I ask you the final question. And I can't remember the specifics of it now, but I mean I've seen it.
Well, that bit in its defence, that bit played really well with me watching it in the early noughties. Because when I was still at high school and I was learning how to sort of very basically, GCSE media studies level think critically and think about what sources were trying to. What direction writers were trying to nudge me in and things like that. I mean, it certainly made an impact on me because I just hadn't really thought about that kind of thing before. And I suppose you can always say that the audience... It's a matter of degrees, isn't it? Because you generally, in this sort of fiction, have to present those kind of slightly esoteric professional ideas to the general audience, but in a way that feels more organic and believable to people more in the know.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I just found the whole thing just slightly mystical. And as I say, it might at least be partly the distance of time. Maybe it was more of but also I mean, when you start thinking about it for 5 minutes, it's well, okay, but also people kind of, I mean, doesn't everybody know about push polls at this point? Isn't that kind of and I feel like they're kind of, naively, I feel like they've kind of stopped reporting on them. Maybe that's completely wrong. Maybe I just read papers that don't report on them anymore. Maybe actually the Mail still run push polls on quite a regular basis. Maybe they actually are still a powerful propaganda tool, and I'm making an idiot out of myself by assuming they're not. But yeah, I don't know. It just that whole thing felt a bit strange to me somehow, a bit kind of incongruous. But if you take that as coding for she's really, really good shit hot political analyst with a really top class brain that is very impressive, then I guess it, you can kind of forgive if mechanically that's the space she's operating, you can kind of headcanon a little bit or just kind of hand wave the specifics.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting the way that Sarah's part of his. You were talking about the dynamics of the Conservative Party. Sarah's part of his visible court in a way that Matty isn't in the first series. Their relationship, at least within House of Cards, remains pretty much secret, doesn't it? We were coming at the end of House of Cards. You get Stamper throwing some shade about it, but and we will get to Stamper. Do not worry. But but in this, Sarah's publicly welcomed into a circle. She's carted around the sort of special conferences. Is it like a weekend at Chequers? And she's kind of she gets a bit piqued, doesn't she, by how he's seeing. He chooses to sort of see her and consult with her alone in his rooms, to kind of get everyone stoked up about the sort of frism of the PM seeing this woman, and she's dead on. And he, to be fair, he doesn't dissemble much about that's what he's doing.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really key point. The idea that she's part of the court, and actually, of course, that fact becomes integral to the narrative because the tension between Sarah and Stamper becomes more and more acute as the story goes on, and that's it's a key component of what happens in the final episode. And I mean that bit of the narrative I really enjoy. I really like how that plays out. Again, I'm not sure how much it holds up if you try and examine it in a rational way, but in a dramatic, in an emotional way, I think that bit of it works really well because Stamper's spurned lover. I'm just never getting over that. I'd forgotten how deep they go with that in this, and it's just glorious. Yeah, it's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful stuff. But yeah, I was thinking about in terms of her as a member of the court, but it's interesting because she isn't. She's there in the inner circle, but she's not there in the public facing. She's not on camera. I don't think she's never seen. So that's an interesting space that she operates in. The other thing that I wasn't quite sure about in terms of the fiction was, I was kind of surprised she needed to find out who Matty was. I found it kind of implausible that someone who's as strong a political animal as Sarah Harding clearly is doesn't know about the girl who committed suicide from the roof garden when Francis Urquhart was up there the day he became Prime Minister. I would have thought that would stick in the mind.
Yeah. Well, and imagine the early internet conspiracy groups that must exist in the House of Cards universe about that.
Yeah, and, you just think, really? And I mean, look, there's other aspects of Urquhart that we're going to come to, I suspect, about how powerful he's become. Maybe maybe it was hushed up. Maybe it was. I mean, obviously they can't not report on it, but the decision about whether or not a story gets carried on page 1 or page 3 or page 5 or page 7 on any given day is to a certain degree, can to a certain degree be a matter of debate, and which page it gets carried on does have an impact on the long term, longevity of the story and the impact it has in the wider public. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, and they only really seriously deal with one of the news editors in this, don't they? But they basically, with him as a stand-in for the wider kind of mainstream media, they reiterate that Urquhart has almost complete control over them now.
Yeah, and
it doesn't take much to rein them back in, does it, if they go astray?
But that's really interesting, isn't it? Because that's an inversion. One of the things I thought was really strong in House of Cards, and we commented on it when we were doing that show, was how actually Francis was deeply kind of, certainly in performatively, he was deeply servile to the I mean, he was an American, but he was clearly a Rupert Murdoch proxy character. He was incredibly deferential to that guy. And yeah, it's very interesting how the relationship with the press has shifted in this story. Although I do also like how the press kind of pendulums back and forth as the story goes on. That aspect of it I really enjoyed. There's a very kind of it's underplayed, like they don't hit it too hard on the nose, I don't think, but it's all the stronger for that, about the fickleness of the tabloid press in particular, but the British press in general. And actually I like how that plays out, because it's almost in the background, and it's very, very it's clearly very cynical on the part of the editors and the papers themselves. I like how that plays out in this. I think they do a really good job of that. But yeah, your point is interesting, that Francis is just in complete control in this narrative. In a way that he wasn't. And that's interesting, because the tension in House of Cards was, is he going to pull it off, and how is he going to pull it off? In this one, it really just is how, I think. It doesn't feel... I never felt any doubt from the first episode that Francis was going to come out on top this time.
Do you want to talk a bit more about Elizabeth? Because you touched on that there when you were talking about her kind of being the... what would you call it, in like Fiddler on the Roof and stuff, the sort of matchmaker to him and Sarah. But there's also that at the same time, I think mostly in episode 1, but later in the series as well, as we near the climax, you've got Elizabeth as being the, as you hinted at before, you've got Elizabeth as being the impetus to stir Francis out of a kind of malaise that he's got into. And at the end of episode 1, when his conflict with the king is starting to really, get to points of no return, really, she's the one who says, "Break him, Francis," isn't she? So she's kind of his. I don't want to be crude, but kind of his fluffer in a few different ways, isn't she? Like she seems to be able to do things to his political and, I guess, like male libido in ways that other people don't, despite the unconventionality of their marriage. So
the classic kind of, and I do think of it as a small c conservative phrase, is behind every great man is a great woman, right? And I think that, I mean, I love how. I mean, I love Elizabeth as a character, full stop. I think she's great in all 3 series. I love how she becomes more and more prominent as the show goes on. I mean, not to do the show before we do it, but her role in the final cut is humongous, right? She's a massive, massive part of that narrative. And this, funnily enough, this story actually kind of, another way of looking at it in terms of its place in the trilogy, this is the story where Elizabeth starts to assert herself. I think she's always been a catalyzing agent. That's always the role she's served. She is the one in House of Cards who says to Francis, "You could do it. You'd be a better leader. You're twice the man that any of them," or whatever it is, But she makes that very direct, and it is a sexual comment, right? It is it is twice the man they are, or whatever it was, and that there's definitely a hint of kind of sexual challenge about that. So yeah, I love how in this story she's both pimp and hype man. She's always there, but it can't be understated how important she is, because she is the only person that Francis is honest with. I mean, we talked about the relationship with Stamper in the last one. We're going to get to it again here, because obviously that's again a key component of this narrative. But like, as close as he is to Stamper in some ways, there are very clear boundaries. There are very clear lines in the sand. Elizabeth is the one person he confides in completely, and actually it's kind of implied that he's kind of in her thrall. she's
Yeah.
kind of the real power. And that, like, there's all kinds of really kind of terrifying sort of misogynistic assumptions under the surface of that, if you think about it for 5 minutes.
Do you think she's been broomsticking more leaves onto a bonfire in between series?
Well, all I'm saying is if they do a 4th season and it turns out that the final shot is her skeleton in a dress, I wouldn't be at all surprised. I think that's the logical conclusion. But it's just really, I think that's just really interesting the way that plays out. And in this one, it's key because she's there, as you say, at the end of episode 1, break him, Francis. She's also obviously there at the climax in episode 4. She's the one who's like, I mean, basically, man up. It's time to do the thing you don't want to do,
Yeah, and we'll get into how that's, well, not so much in this episode, but obviously that's a bit of a dry run for some aspects of the final cut as well. And I'd forgotten how much of it hinted that. Not just her actions, but the state in which you see Francis, the state of doubt.
Yes.
The point that he's turned into a man who is a bit broken, in ways that he wasn't in the first series. And I think that's an interesting... I don't think that contradicts him as a character. I think that's an interesting thread.
No, I agree. I don't think it does at all. Because I think, if you want to... I mean, I don't know how much of this is intentional. That's always an interesting question. But I think it's about... I mean, for me, one of the things that shows like this do well, shows like The Crown do well, for that matter, even to a degree The West Wing, even though it was trying very hard not to, is... For me, and I would say this as a lefty, but they do highlight, for me, like the basic impossibility of being a functioning human being in a power structure that big and that has that much heft. Like it's just it's almost impossible to retain your humanity and do that job the way it's supposed to be done, whatever that means. Like it does kind of crush. There's something inherently kind of soul crushing about it. And Francis is an animal in some ways almost uniquely engineered, in terms of his standing in British culture and his positioning within the party and his class position and his privilege to ride that tiger. And even this almost perfect specimen of the ideal kind of Machiavellian, amoral, maneuverer and powermonger, psychologically can't cope with the strain of doing this job. Like fundamentally, because it's not a job that's fit for human beings. It just isn't.
And to the extent that he still is one.
Yeah. But I like that because I've got a really, not to get onto one of my hobby horses for too long here, but like I get very, 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 very angry about monstering, about the personification of human evil as somehow being other. I think it's a terrible, terrible thing that we do in fiction when we do that. I think it's really important to understand that in real life, all of our monsters, all of our most feared and hated and reviled monsters are absolute human beings. We forget that at our peril. We ignore that at our peril. When you monster an other and you try and indicate that they're not human, you're abdicating. I think you're abdicating moral responsibility for what they are. And more to the point, never mind the moral argument. In terms of pragmatism, you can't combat what you don't understand. And if you misapply kind of what are effectively supernatural labels to something that isn't supernatural, you're misunderstanding it. And if you're misunderstanding it, you're not going to be able to combat it effectively.
Well, I mean, we won't go off beast fully, but
it's a real thing because I get on the whenever Hannibal comes up, I end up kicking off on it because I love it, but I hate it.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, as non-conservatives watching recent UK politics, you get kind of a very condensed case study of that in Theresa May, for example, don't you? Her short career as Premier, because in that, and obviously it was a time of quite extreme shifts and pivots in politics in general, but her short career just as PM encompasses like the most gimlet-eyed, imperial, debate avoiding, wannabe autocratic, hard woman kind of stuff, all the way to basically seeing her depart Downing Street in borderline tears because she's been crushed by her own inadequacies and disloyalty and careerism around her and the forces she unleashed and couldn't ride successfully, and it was all there for most of us to see, and I'm sure much more behind closed doors.
And the machinations of the even worse people behind her. Absolutely. Really, really good case study in that. And even our imperial phases, even our Thatchers and Blairs. Thatcher left in tears. Blair, did leave on his own terms, but it hasn't exactly covered himself in glory in his post-parliamentary career, I wouldn't argue. And I I've talked about it a lot with James Murphy, a friend of mine who does a lot of podcasts, and because he did a study of the American presidents, and his thing was like, it's just that role is fundamentally unsuited to humans. Like, you shouldn't have to do like. It's only going to attract very, very, very strange people who are ill suited to wielding power to start with, and then it's going to do such a number on them. And I think the show does it because it is. I mean, that's what I think. Because one of the things I've been thinking about a lot since the last show we did was the question you asked me about, like, why are we so fascinated by Francis Urquhart? And I had a crack at it. I'm still not sure I really understand, but as we're talking around this now, I realise certainly for me, part of it is exactly that. It's the core of it that he is absolutely awful. He is irredeemably, immoral and vile. He is still recognisably human, and he is still recognisably fallible, and he is still, even as I say, a kind of almost perfectly genetically engineered creature to this form of power. He still can't wield it in any way that doesn't destroy him ultimately.
I think what we'll do is we'll talk about Stamper. We'll get that out of our systems, and then we'll talk. Then we'll pivot to if you like, we'll move from Downing Street to the King's Court, and we'll talk because I really want to talk briefly about the kind of two new main characters who are introduced as the King's, the people on the King's shoulder. Absolutely. Basically, because I think they're interesting and very 93 in some ways. But then I think we'll have final thoughts obviously, but we'll kind of leave Michael Kitchen and that whole thing for the end, and how he relates to Urquhart and what he is, what he's doing there, because I think that's a whole big thing. So Stamper, fun bit. Open your beers. So he's. I said to you, didn't I, in the first conversation about House of Cards, that Stamper wasn't in the book, and he was invented by Andrew Davis, the screenwriter for House of Cards, and obviously isn't that much in the first series, but he does steal quite a few scenes, and they really do elevate him in this, don't they? I mean, he's made party chairman at an early stage, isn't he? And obviously, as a lot of the plot of To Play the King is about the practicalities of calling and wisdom of calling a general election, and kind of managing that. Stamper's at the forefront of that, but obviously the sort of surface level of this is that, I think you mentioned this even in the first podcast, is that Stamper gets done by Urquhart as Urquhart was done by Coleridge.
Yeah.
Why?
It is. In all honesty, it is, for me. I think it's the weakest narrative moment in the entire trilogy. It doesn't really make sense. And what I like, I think, is the sheer brass balls of the show that it kind of admits it. Because there's that wonderful scene in episode 4 where Urquhart says, "Why did I do that?" Why did I mistreat him like that? I misjudged him. Why did I do that?
Because Elizabeth tries to let him off the hook, doesn't she? She says, like, he deserved it. And he's like, no, he wanted to serve me. It's like he sees it now. He's like,
he wanted to serve me. I treated him cruelly. And I pulled the quote. I'll see if I can find it, because it really hit me. I treated him with contempt because it pleased me, because that's the way it works.
So is he just, because they've done, obviously in the first series, and a bit in this as well, you see them working side by side, Stamper's always the subordinate, obviously, but they kind of work as much in tandem as they can in terms of essentially stripping people's dignity down and destroying them and pocketing them for future use. Is that just, can Urquhart just ultimately not switch that off? Is he essentially just a wild animal in some respects? His sadism is just unrestrained.
So I read it as... Yeah, I think effectively, yes. I think what I'd build on by saying that is that it's the product of that very particular upper crust public school system, which clearly Stamper and Urquhart are both products of. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that they went to incredibly expensive boarding schools from a very young age, and everything that would have entailed in the era in which they did it. Bear in mind their age in the 90s. That means they would have been going through that at a time that, in terms of child welfare, we would consider to be like, prehistoric, never mind, or dark ages. Just horrific, and I think, I think that my read on it absolutely was that Urquhart, and again, it's kind of what we were talking about, like he is ultimately a product of his environment, just as we all are, and that represent, that, because it's, for me, the telling line is that's the way it works. There's this immutable kind of law of the jungle, where it's everything's seen in terms of dominance and submission, everything's seen in terms of power and subservience to power. And, and Stamper's always been Urquhart's second. Always been his deputy. And yes, loyal, absolutely. And I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting about it is that even in House of Cards, it's clear that of the two of them, Stamper's the one who gets his hands dirty. Stamper's the one who will, I think there's a thing, was it, he says in this show, like, I'm a discoverer of unregarded trifles or something is like that, the way he works, which is just so wonderful. You just get the impression like this guy spends his entire weekend reading through every single local newspaper in the country, just in case he finds a little bit of dirt on someone that he can, that's the level at which this guy is operating.
And in this he gets sent on little tawdry little subquests,
exactly,
to talk to newspaper editors and to manipulate the princess and things. And
there is an element of that thing about like that. Again, it's that public school thing of like the first year boys have to act effectively as servants to the sixth formers, right? That was a real and that was a real thing. That was, I mean, if you haven't yet, not you, I'm assuming you've read it, but other people, like Roald Dahl's autobiography, Boy. I mean, read that sometime. And get yourself a glimpse of what the real world was like for kids in that environment not so very long ago. And certainly the age of these characters, that's the kind of environment they'd have been through. And for me, that's the key to that relationship. And that, I mean, I'm kind of talking myself around to that it does make sense. Because what that means is that Urquhart is as much a prisoner of his upbringing as anybody else is. And that there's a kind of Shakespearean tragedy element to it, or even a Greek tragedy element to it. The same seeds that make him what he is inevitably lead to his destruction. In this case, his inability to not be cruel to the person he considers to be a subordinate, even though, and I love that moment of reflection where, as you say, Elizabeth tries to let off the gun. He says, no, he was loyal. And that far too late revelation to her, like, what, why? Because it's the question I was asking all the way through the show, all the way through this. My central question as I was watching it develop was like, Francis, why are you doing this? You're brighter than that. You know this is a terrible idea. And why not reward the guy? He's like, he knows where every single body is buried. Give him any job he wants. What do you care? He loves you. Like, he finds someone that looks at you the way Stamper looks at Urquhart people. I'm begging you.
The memes right.
And when you do find them, do not let them go. Do not treat them like shit, because otherwise it will end badly for both of you.
Well, I've got two things to say about that. One is that this is more. I think we'll more and more in this podcast get more into sort of Final Cut spoilers and stuff like that. But you talk about Urquhart and the younger Urquhart, perhaps this is all speculative, of course, being part of power structures that force him into acts of cruelty, or he feels they do. Obviously, that's I think people who've seen the Final Cut will know what we're sort of hinting at there. You might uncover more there. The other thing is talking about Stamper. You saying Urquhart knows where the bodies are buried. I mean, I suppose there is the thing that in this, the tape of Matty's death becomes a MacGuffin, and obviously some of that persists into the Final Cut as well. And Urquhart doesn't know he's got that on him.
No, that's a lovely moment, isn't it, when he finds out as well? That's so great. Yeah. I mean, the tape's interesting. Again, I found myself because there's the moment where Stamper does the big reveal with Sarah, right? He does that whole. I mean, let's not get into the whole how come Stamper knows street thugs that he can just hire to beat people up, because I don't.
Yeah, that's a bit weird.
I was having RoboCop flashbacks. So this is my whole kind of thing of like, how does Dick Jones and Clarence Boddicker know each other? How did that?
Oh, do you think Stamper has a Clarence?
Well, exactly. That's like, seriously, inquiring minds want to know. But leaving that aside, and although there's a whole doorway we could open there about the way this show portrays people who aren't upper middle class at best, which I could say a few things about. But it's interesting to me how, there's that big revelation scene. And Stamper says to her, yes, someone picked up the tape and gave it to me. And it's like, who is someone? And why didn't they listen to it? Why did it end up in your pocket? That, to me, it doesn't matter, but it's a really interesting mystery to me that there is this kind of... Because it's not Stamper himself. But then you start to think about, so what this means is this is part of Stamper's network. Like, he just has such a massive network of people that whoever it was who found that tape knew this is the guy I want to give it to. And that's... Yeah.
Do you know who I think it was? I'm semi-joking. Elizabeth. She doesn't like Francis to play the, life on easy mode,
I'm instant headcanon. I'm having that.
Not because she wanted to bring him down.
No.
Or even
Just to keep him on his
she knew he
toes.
could deal with it. Yeah.
No, absolutely. No, because it's no fun if it's too easy.
Exactly. And the tape doesn't implicate her.
No,
so.
well, yeah, absolutely.
So why not?
Well, yeah, self-preservation uber alles. But yeah, no, she's I mean, but I love that, and I love that kind of. I mean, that whole scene I think is, as I say, as much as like I'm not convinced it works in story terms, but in terms of like the emotional dramatic heft of that scene, it's just, you know, those two actors on the screen doing that, you kind of just don't care. You just like do whatever you need to do with the story to get those two in that room for that scene, because it's magic.
Oh, do you mean the scene where Stamper talks to Sarah in that sort of abandoned warehouse thing? Yeah, well, I mean that's one of those kind of shaky planks I might be talking about, isn't it? But it's also great where he's like, she's like, how do I know that's real or whatever? And he's like, you know, it's real.
Yeah.
You know, and she just lingers on it, and that is both a bit lazy and also, you know, she's been with Urquhart, she's talked to him, you know, she's heard the way he talks about Matty and the way something's a bit off about it, and you know, it's kind of.
I actually really liked that moment, because for me that was about Stamper respecting Sarah's intelligence, actually, because that was about what I love about that was like, actually it's what we were talking about earlier, you know, that thing about like there's this whole, one of the things I'm constantly fascinated by with the psychology of, I mean, I carefully couched it in terms of the far right, but that thing about the cognitive dissonance of believing something and not believing it at the same time. The idea that sometimes, you know, like, I mean, we were talking about in terms of Trump supporters, like how many Trump supporters really, really, really believe it, and how many of them pretend they believe it or sort of believe it because it's convenient to them because it fulfills and blah, blah, blah. And there's a whole spectrum of thing. But for me, that moment is Stamper kind of cutting the red wire and saying, no, this is a no bullshit zone. You know. And actually that landed for me. That worked really well, because Sarah is a bright woman. And yeah, she does know. She absolutely knows this guy is actually a monster. And well,
he's the guy who stood over on the balcony when Elizabeth was first talking to her, like Dracula. You know, again we talked about the Dracula-like elements of it, you know, gazing down on her. You know, I just want to talk briefly about Stamper's sort of sexuality and like coding, and I guess you might say even as relatively recently as '93, because I think it's notable. We'll talk about this again in a sec when we talk about David Mycroft, but. This is kind of the trilogy. This is kind of the gay one, isn't it? This is the one. This is the one. I know. But that's how they would have pitched it.
Look, kids, just to be clear, if you haven't seen it, it's a sin. Okay, don't go getting excited. This is not like.
Yeah. No, that is
set in the
fair.
same era. Very different story.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, I mean it obviously tries to engage to some extent with what was then fairly groundbreaking mainstream telly, you know, in Britain. But the reason I mentioned that before we move on to David Mycroft's character is Stamper is, you know, the scene, for example, you know, we talk about him being a spurned lover kind of type for Urquhart in this, you know, but there's also that scene where he's in the sauna, and it's not so much the fact that, you know, like two men sat in a sauna is innately camp or anything like that, but it's obviously the performance that Colin Jeavons gives has its moments of camp, but we've just been talking about how threatening and psychopathic Stamper can be and self-serving, but you know that scene where he sort of exhales and he's just like, he can be such a swine, Brian. He's just like, you know, that's so vulnerable and so like exhausted and so resigned, you know. And
I mean, it is, but actually it's also, it transpires, it's, in retrospect, I think actually it's also very calculated, because that's the moment where Stamper is starting to pivot in his own mind to a post-Urquhart world. He's actually laying the groundwork for his own leadership bit, effectively. Because that conversation is the first plank that he's laying down for his version of what Urquhart did in House of Cards, right? So yeah, it's interesting, because it is on one level it is a moment of vulnerability, and but actually it's a very considered performance, because what he's doing there is he's laying the ground, because it's probably the first time he's ever said anything that could be even remotely interpreted as disloyal. And actually that's a groundbreaking moment, and for a journalist like that, and it's in the performance, I think, like his ears prick up when Stamper says that. His demeanour does change, because it's like, that is crossing a line. That's crossing a line that Stamper's never crossed before, and he's got very, very, very good political reasons for doing that. Yeah.
One thing that I mentioned about coding, and that might sound like quite an archaic term for a 90s drama, although obviously it existed in forms. But the reason I was saying that is I was thinking of, in a previous podcast, me and my brother talked about All About Eve, the 50s film. And at the end of that, George Sanders, who's coded as a camp, perhaps gay theatre critic, and that he sort of takes possession of a woman, like, you know, essentially by blackmail and stuff like that. And you get the sense that he also hints that he is going to take possession of her physically as well, you know.
Right.
But you also get the very, particularly to a modern audience, but I think to an audience at the time, that he's doing it more out of, this is what he does to people, rather than any kind of like innate sexuality, that kind of thing. It really reminded me of, you know, I think it's Stamper's last scene with Sarah, when he sort of says, you know, you keep quiet, you bide your time till after the election, and we'll be all right together, and you'll be with me. I think he says, like, you know, you know what I mean, or something like that. And there's and she looks repulsed, obviously, but like, it's kind of, he seems to sort of want her. I think something that complicates even a sort of surface reason of Stamper's sexuality is he seems to sort of want to take, I guess, Daddy's girlfriend. You know?
Yeah, I mean, my kind of read on it is like Stamper. I just don't think Stamper has sexuality as we understand sexuality. I think he's just his own animal. I mean, it's like, it's either some completely highly specialized, highly extreme BDSM, and I wouldn't want to know if he was the guy in the gimp suit or the guy with the whip. But, you know, like, it's...
Yeah. Oh, I think it's far weirder than
like,
that. I think
it's like that level, or it's some very, 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 very hyper-specific kind of nanny fixation thing, maybe?
Yeah.
Like, but my thing with Stamper is, like, no, he's like... the element of control, I think, is absolutely key. And I think you're right. I think that's a dead-on reading of that scene. I don't think it's anything to do with Sarah as a human being. It's Sarah as an object, and and it's specifically about the knowledge that he would be taking from Francis, something that Francis valued. I think that's really, it's pure power. You know, it's pure power dynamic. And again, you know, that kind of analogy from before about, you know, chess pieces. I mean, she's just another, not a pawn, maybe like a, you know, she's maybe a knight or a bishop. She's a valuable piece, you know. But that's sort of, I mean, Stamper's so fascinating to me in this show. I'm so glad that they gave the character the kind of space they give him in this. I think because the actor's just phenomenal, and he gives it, you know, he grabs hold of every scene with both hands. It's just like, I'm having it, and I love that, you know.
He does, and I think isn't this? I talked about Kitty Aldridge before and her career choices after this, but wasn't it kind of Colin Jeavons' departure from acting as well? I think he kind of retired after this. I think obviously he was a bit old, he's a lot older than her, you know. But
yeah,
I think this was almost like his finale performance.
It's certainly, he'd go some to top it. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and I love the pathology of Stamper. I find Stamper endlessly fascinating, almost as fascinating as Urquhart. In his own way, and in a way, in one particular way, more fascinating in that we never ever get Stamper's interiority. We are left guessing ultimately as to what is going on under the hood beyond. You know?
Wouldn't it be great if the final cut went a bit more OTT and started doing ghosts, honest to God ghosts? Because I would love Stamper to show up.
Well, can you imagine? I think about it like you do it like A Christmas Carol, right?
Oh, amazing.
And Stamper would be like, come out. He'd be Marley, right? He'd come out the door knocker and be like,
sure, yeah. These are the chains that I forged in life, you know, for you,
you bastard.
Yeah.
I can't wait for you to die so I can give them to you.
But sadly, we have to say goodbye to Stamper at this time. So farewell, Stamper.
Stamper, come back.
Leaving him behind, not forgotten.
You must know there are two ways of contending, the one by law, the other by force. The first method is natural to man, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently insufficient, it is essential to have recourse to the second. Therefore it is necessary for a prince to understand how to take advantage of the beast and the man. Princes have learnt this from the classical writers who describe how Achilles and many other ancient princes were given to the centaur Chiron to train in his own discipline, which means that, as they had for teacher a half-beast and half-man, so a prince learned how to make use of both natures, and that he cannot survive with one and not the other. He who is the cause of another becoming powerful is himself ruined, because that predominancy has been brought about either by cunning or by force. Both are distrusted by the one who has been brought to power. The wish to acquire is, in truth, very natural and common, and men always do so when they can, and for this they will be praised, not blamed. But when they cannot do so, yet wish to do so by any means, then there is folly and blame. Nothing disappears so rapidly as generosity, for even whilst you exercise it, you are losing the ability to do so, and so become either poor or despised, or else, in avoiding poverty, avaricious and hated. And above all things, a prince should guard himself against being despised and hated, and generosity leads to both. Therefore it is wiser to have a reputation for meanness which brings disapproval without hatred, than to be compelled through seeking a reputation for generosity to incur a name for avarice which brings both disapproval and hatred.
So I touched on talk about the sorts of new court characters before, but as we sort of warm up to talking about the king, but so David Mycroft is one that I was talking about before because he's, I don't know what you think of the well, firstly the efficacy of his plot in this, but also the kind of the obvious datedness of it to an extent, because it's like a then I think fairly sensitively rendered coming out plot. Yeah, really, isn't it?
I really like it. So I think the first thing that it's really important to bear in mind is that you're right, the timing of it. I mean, it's not just dated; it's carbon dated, right? But it's, you know, it's really. It seems boggling to the modern mind to understand that it's not just living memory, but like comfortable living memory. That the age of consent for gay men was 21, and it was 21 until, I believe, until the Blair years. I actually don't think it. I think it was New Labour who finally equalised it. Major may have lowered the age to 18, but it was certainly 21 for most of my childhood and early adolescence. And you know. What that means for gay men of our age is they grew up in an era where it was made clear by the law of the land that they were not considered equal to heterosexual men in terms of their ability to decide whether or not, you know, who they wanted to sleep with, bluntly, right? And that represents a wider social issue around the perception of, and it is gay men in particular in this case, because lesbians just don't exist happily for them in some ways in terms of this kind of law. But there's a whole set of untested assumptions that lurk directly behind that. And the reason, and you know, I'm sorry to have to go through, because this is kind of gross, but we need to understand this to understand the context of the show. The reason the age of consent was 21 for gay men was because there was this perception of gay men as predatory. That's why it was set at 21, because there was this mortal dread of the older gay man seducing the boy, right? So that's where that differential comes from. And like, if you're lucky enough to be young enough that you didn't grow up in that era, it's kind of hard to get your head around. And this show will make absolutely no sense to you whatsoever, because it's absolutely crucial to understanding the gay plot in this. And we're still at least 4 years off Queer as Folk. Yeah, right. Absolutely, you know, absolutely. Because the really important part about it is that what I'd forgotten the show does is it explicitly differentiates between an adult gay man who falls into a loving relationship with another adult gay man, which I actually think is, like, I found it genuinely moving. I was actually kind of,
it's very tender,
I got really invested in their relationship. I was like, oh, please, can these two just live happily ever after? This is really sweet. It's beautifully played. And
I think it's partly because you meet David Mycroft and his marriage is not just falling apart, but it's done, basically, isn't it? Like, he's a wreck of a man and very unhappy. So
absolutely,
kind of like
absolutely. But also, what is interesting is that the show directly confronts the dichotomy, because it has Mycroft bump into a Tory backbencher, I think, in a gay club, who's dating a suspiciously young-looking man, and that guy ends up getting done for paedophilia, right? He actually ends up...
Is he actually called Staines?
He's called Staines.
Another great House of Cards name.
Because if you want subtlety, then, you know...
there are other shows.
Other shows are available. Yeah, the subtlety game's down the street somewhere. But yeah, but I think it's really interesting because I don't want to like. It's definitely ham-handed. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's definitely heavy-handed. It's definitely awkward. It's definitely kind of difficult to look back on. But it's a great example of like. I think anyway, it's a great example of someone trying really, really, really hard. You know, someone reaching as hard as they can with their own limited understanding and their own positionality and worldview to try and get somewhere that's positive. You know.
It's interesting as well. We talk about it as being a coming out story, but he obviously his employer and sort of old friend is the king, and he doesn't actually come out to the king, does he? Or presumably by the end of the story, the king knows because it's become a matter of public record.
I really wonder about.
But you don't actually have that scene.
Yeah, I wonder about that because I think funnily enough, my read of that scene this time is the king does know. Actually, he's always known and he doesn't care. That's my read of it genuinely because you're right. There's a wonderful confrontation scene where he's about to come out and the king basically forbids him from doing it. Effectively, the king says, I don't care. I don't want to know. You've been miserable for 20 years. If you're happy now and you're shagging yourself silly, like, just go for your life, mate. Couldn't care less.
Yeah.
But for me, the way he says it and the implications of it, I think he does know, and he just doesn't want it said out loud because for whatever reason.
His generation class don't say those things out loud.
Yeah,
you know, but, yeah.
Or if you want to be charitable, maybe he just genuinely thinks that it's actually none of his business. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and also the king as portrayed here, but also, you know, his near equivalent in real life. You know, like, I mean, if they started to talk about personal stuff, where would it end, basically?
Well, no. Yeah, that is a good point. And there's enough similarity there that we can assume that, that probably did play into his thinking. Yeah, fair enough.
Well, let's pivot straight over to Chloe, because she's the sort of, is it like race equality, what we now call a race equalities consultant? I can't remember what the term they uses here, but she's kind of the...
minorities advisor.
Yeah, she's kind of the, you know, if David Mycroft is the cautious conservative on the king's shoulder, she's meant to be the sort of liberal angel on his shoulder, so to speak. Or angel is debatable, but like, you know, that's also very 93, you know.
Absolutely.
But it's interesting that the show is engaging with what would have been seen as early 90s kind of liberal forces. And they're putting them around the king, isn't it? Like, I mean, we'll get on more. We'll get on more to what, you know, dealing with what the king does and represents in this show in general. But like, she is kind of. I love that line when she meets Urquhart at the palace. You know, Urquhart meets her and she says like, you know, this is my advice. The king's like, this is my advisor for minorities, and he's like, all minorities, and she's like, what's the line? Is it like, some I embody, for others I use empathy?
Yeah, it's a great line. It's a great line because the empathy line is a total fu to Francis. It's a total like. It's yes. I'm sure you've read about this. No, it's absolutely.
She might be the one character who doesn't verbally best.
That's true.
He like game recognized game. He's like, fair enough.
Yeah.
You've got your patch.
They don't get too many scenes together, and I guess but you're right actually. And also I think like he probably realizes like ultimately he doesn't have to beat her. If he can beat the boss, then she gets taken out by default. But no, I mean there's an interesting moment later on where they're arguing on their way to the photo opportunity. The disaster at the explosion at the flats, and they're having this really heated argument. And she makes this really cogent point about like, no, this wasn't an accident. This was a disaster waiting to happen because of economic inequality and because of the particular state of that housing stock. By the way, I have to say, watching that scene post Grenfell has very, very different resonances, and it was really kind of, I found that I got kind of a wallop from that I wasn't expecting.
This makes me sound like the worst kind of person who cares more about TV than real life, Kit, but that I thought about this show the week of Grenfell.
Right, oh, that's interesting. You made the connection. Yeah.
Especially the proximity to an election. I mean, it's the other way around.
Yes.
But
so anyway, that was really kind of interesting to me because it was like, and that's one of those things where it's like, it's not about, I mean, you know, there's nothing mystical about that. But what's interesting is her argument is entirely correct. Her argument is entirely correct. Yes, this is cause and effect, actually. This is exactly what happens when you pursue a particular kind of economic policy that doesn't involve any kind of engagement in welfare and various... So she articulates that perfectly. And then the rebuttal from the other guy was, stop spouting that Marxist nonsense. I mean, like...
Yes.
And it was amazing to me because
that's David Mycroft as well, who's quite a sympathetic character.
Yeah, absolutely. In the wider context, a very sympathetic character, but in that moment, and I was just like, and the thing that hit me really forcefully there was that I see that all the time. Like, that is the counter argument. Label it as Marxist and forget about it. Like that's the essence of what I see in the discourse now. in politics in 2020, 2021. You know, you make any point with any kind of argument about nuance involving social justice or involving, you know, any kind of progressive, but it doesn't even have to be socialist, any kind of liberal policy, and you'll immediately see in the reply someone just, oh, that's a load of lefty bollocks or a load of Marxist nonsense, and it's just it was quite. It's a throwaway moment. I don't want to read too much into it, but it did hit me quite hard because it was like, that's a really impressive moment where you present a coherent argument. The response is a non-argument. There's no argument there at all, and yet they're treated with equal weight.
I don't know if the show does, really. I mean, I suppose the king has to listen to both of them. But, like, I think... I mean, we touched on this in the first episode very briefly, but, like, kind of... This is Michael Dobbs being filtered through Andrew Davis, and I don't think Andrew Davis is a communist or anything. No. But he's definitely a more
But he's
liberal
to the left of... Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And he seems to be right, and he's got this kind of slight... I wouldn't say anarchic quite, but this kind of... He's got this gleeful, perverse fascination with things, hasn't he, Andrew Davis, in general? You know, like, he's even able to do, like, you might say slightly spicy versions of things like Pride and Prejudice and you know, War and Peace and things like that. I mean, I was actually just thinking when we were talking about David and Chloe before, like, they are like a kind of, although their camp, you might say, ends in defeat, they are kind of like a healthy mirror of Stamper and Sarah, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because Stamper, David is the, I mean, you know, sexuality debated, you know, or not, you know, he's the loyal friend of the boss who actually finds a happy place in the end where he can inhabit that role and live a fairly fulfilling life. Whereas Chloe is, you know, she has that line where she's talking with David about the right way to advise the king, and he's like, you know, you're just using him for your agenda, and she's like, of course I am, he's using me, you know, like she's found a peace with that with Sarah, and she even, you know, you hint that she is about to embark on a sexual relationship with the king, don't you, in that one scene. But it seems to be coming from a slightly healthier place, and obviously we assume the king doesn't have skeletons in his closet to the extent of pushing someone off a roof. You know.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I think the show does, and this is hinting at what we were talking about earlier in terms of the opposition not really existing, it reminds me of that, you know, the joke in the Blues Brothers movie where they go in the bar and they say, oh, we have both kinds of music here, country and western. And this show, it's like we have conservatism and liberalism, and that really is it. And I think that you know, that argument I was talking about earlier kind of typifies that, really. Now, that's an argument between, I mean, it's actually an argument between two liberals, but that's like a right-wing liberal and a left-wing liberal having an argument, and that's what those two represent. Whereas, you know, on the other side of the fence, you've basically got, I mean, I don't even know how you describe the two camps of Stamper and Sarah in terms of conservative politics, because they're both, I mean, I think they're both viciously right-wing, but I think she's a kind of, I think the difference there actually is class. I think the difference there is background. She strikes me as kind of nouveau riche, up and coming, upper middle class, still got a bit of a chip on his shoulder. He
Kensington set, kind of, you know, like
whereas Stamper is, you know, old school public school, product of the system, you know, that kind of born to rule. There's got to be minor aristocratic blood in Stamper's history. Like, he's probably still pissed off about it, right? It's probably a bastard son of some minor thing, and he's still got his due, like, you know, and it's a grudge that goes back 4 centuries that he's still angry about.
Well, it's so interesting you say that, because I think mixing your comment about aristocratic blood with my sort of slight reference to Kensington, you know, I think if we move on to properly talking about the you know, the king in this now, because what brought me back to that circularly was we were so I think everyone listening to this far has seen To Play the King, or at least cares, you know, about it, or at least has read up about it. Obviously, Michael Kitchen is playing here in the early 90s a kind of parallel universe version of a version of Prince Charles ascending to the throne. You know, it's not a one-on-one character. There are elements of him, aren't there, like things like his architectural conservatism, things like that are drawn directly from Prince Charles's, you know, known public statements and things like that. And there's obviously he's coming to the throne at a time when Prince Charles might believably have come to the throne, just about. Sure. I mean, this is this thing I sort of hinted at in messages to you, that this. We're haunted by the monarchy in all kinds of really weird ways in Britain. As I said before, we touched on the English Revolution. We're haunted on it as a thing that went away and came back for reasons that we're not really meant to examine and think about too closely. We're haunted by it as something that's always been with us and seems like it always might be. We're also haunted by the historically hugely unusual, well, unique longevity of Queen Elizabeth II in her own way, and we've been rehearsing her death both as a palace ritual, literally rehearsing her death, and rehearsing it as a cultural event, as a coming. I think I sort of slightly facetiously quoted "The Queen is Dead" by the Smiths in 1986 to you. Yeah. That's as old as me. I was born in 1985. There's not much, we've been seriously trying to imagine this future for a long time, and it came out in various dramas. There was a drama, I think 5-6 years ago on telly called Charles III, which was actually very similar to Play the King in the sense that it was imagining the ascension of Prince Charles and how that might go pear-shaped. In fact, I think in that drama, I seem to remember they had Prince Harry run off with a quote-unquote unsuitable woman, who had other agendas and things like that, But the British people have been kind of trying to imagine the unimaginable, and I think in a way, whatever your political slant, Queen Elizabeth's departure has become a sort of unimaginable, but ultimately so predictable thing, isn't it? Because we're talking 2021, where the sort of situation that precedes this, the situation just before this drama kicks off, where Charles ascends to the throne, is still the precipice that we're hovering on. It's surreal, isn't it? It's such an odd state of being.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the classic observation about death. It's both inevitable and unimaginable, and that's true on a personal level as much as any other. But then we've got this, as you say, we've got this national figurehead, and it's even more inevitable given her age, right? And yet feels as impossible as ever, to me, certainly. Yeah. And for all of us for whom she has been the only monarch we've ever known, which is almost all of us because of how old she is. I mean, this is like, we don't know how to do this. We have no living memory at this point, or almost no living memory of how to do this.
Well, I've talked to people, left-wing activists, both within and without the Labour Party, who are, involved with Republic or have those kind of sentiments that are trying to an extent to plan for anti-monarchical, political activity and kind of, nothing dodgy.
Sure.
nothing untoward, shall we say, but just moving public sentiment in the wake of Queen Elizabeth's death. And those chats I've had generally seem to be, and I'm not rising above this, I'm not saying I'm superior to this, we seem to struggle with it as well. We seem to struggle to really properly imagine that scenario, and I think we almost put our fears and our faith in the idea that the whole British public will wake up one morning and be in a really weird headspace.
Well, look, the nearest dress rehearsal we had, and she wouldn't thank me for making the comparison, but obviously is Diana, right? Because that we went nuts as a nation. I'm sorry, that's probably ableist language, but what the hell, But like I have no explanation for what happened to this nation for the week after Diana died. I've never seen anything like it before or since. It was wild. It was, and I don't think anybody made sense of it then or has made sense of it since either. The thing that makes me that I'm kind of amused by is the collective amnesia we've gone through since. We kind of pretend it didn't happen, but it did. That whatever it was, week or fortnight between her dying and the funeral was like, I don't know what happened to us, man.
We're touching on The Crown, probably like past series and future series here, but the Diana, not to be ghoulish, but like the Diana that died in 97 was obviously a Diana at a certain stage in her life where she'd become that thing, the opposition royal, the royal in exile. Right. Whereas if she died, say, in 1987 from a car crash, she would have been the integrated royal. She would have been to all surface extents, the loyal integrated member of the royal family who died, and that would have been an outpouring, I'm sure, but of a sort of different feel.
But the weird part is when she died, she became both. Because I've got friends who are monarchists, as it happens. I've got friends who are really kind of in favour of the institution and have a real kind of. I think it's worth saying, just to be clear about what I'm saying there, like a real emotional connection. That's their like the particular people I'm thinking about. They acknowledge that they struggle to articulate why it's important to them, and and it's really emotional, and I respect that. That's fine, then whatever, But what's interesting to me is certainly, and this is anecdotal, but certainly those people I know in that camp. Again, we're back to that double think. For me, I'm sure they weren't terribly happy with Diana when she was alive. But as soon as she died, she was back to being... She became everything to everyone all at once. It was the most extraordinary thing. And I'm not...
It's almost like the dead can become symbols that slightly outgrow their original cultural space, isn't it?
And that's one thing. But it's the universality of the symbol that I find fascinating with Diana. Because for AIDS campaigners, she was the AIDS campaigner. For landmines campaigners, she was the landmine campaigner. For monarchists, she was the princess again, even though she hadn't been for however long it had been by that point. I suspect Republicans probably felt something about, like, she's the one they did wrong and what a tragic end to her. You know what I mean? Like, and it's odd how... Yeah, she should. I mean, I'm spitballing because I still, like I say, I don't understand what happened. But she became. It seems to me that part of what it was that she just became this lightning rod for everything. I mean, even incoherent points of view. You know.
Yeah. Well, isn't it weird then that, because to bring it back to Play the King, I think usefully, like if you think about the Michael Kitchen's role in this drama, he becomes that kind of royal. He shows the power, the terrible, unpredictable power of becoming the monarch or person within the royal family who's also an opposition leader, right?
Well,
and that's an energy that Diana, whether she does, quote unquote, deserved it or not, whatever that means, that's an energy she got imbued with, And,
yeah, but I think it does represent. I think it does represent an anxiety about Charles that is real as well. I think there is, amongst the establishment, I think there's an anxiety about Charles. And, from what you said about, conversations you've had with Republican friends, maybe they see Charles as an opportunity, and I could see why they might. Because I think the thing about Charles is he has made... I mean, he's mellowed now, but certainly in the era when this was written, he was making public statements about the environment. It's not just about... I mean, yeah, the thing about the London skyline, but, I mean, you can kind of finesse that as being like, well, yeah, because he lives there. So, whatever. I mean, there's an element of, like, whatever, that's very kind of high level stuff, but his environmentalism, I believe it to be sincere, but that you can't talk about environmentalism without talking about politics at the end of the day. I mean, you can, but
he was seen as a bit of a crank almost, wasn't he?
Well, there's that as well. Yeah,
I think that's faded a bit.
That's faded as well. But you're right. I mean, well, that was certainly interesting. Yeah, that was certainly the caricature. I don't know. I never followed it enough to know for sure how much of that was invented, because I mean, the tabloids. I mean, my God, they love to build someone up and knock them down. But it was interesting. Like, I think for me, the character of Charles in this show really does represent a genuinely felt anxiety in that historical period. And I think you're right about Diana feeds into that as well, funnily enough, in her own way.
Well, she's in the show.
Well, she is in the show. Well, yeah.
Not very disguised.
And isn't that weird? Because one of the things that I found watching this was, like, there is, like, 0% chance you would characterise her in anything approaching the way this show does now. I was fascinated. That was one of my favourite things about rewatching this, was seeing a fictionalised version of Diana created when she was still alive. Very different creature. Very, very different creature. Even to the Crown, which, has made some efforts to delve into the humanity of her and the complicated nature of their relationship. But think about that presentation of Diana in the Crown, and then think about this version of her.
Well, this version, I'd say, is presented as almost a trainee Elizabeth, right? Except her Francis, not in a weird incestuous way, but her Francis is her son. Yeah, that's right. Like he's the vehicle through which she is now going to do loads of things, dark art things. But
she's not naive, and I think she's quite spiky in her own way in this version. She swears. She's quite, and she's quite forthright about... I love the fact they refer to it as the House of Wounded Feelings.
Yeah, that's a great phrase.
It's so good, but like you would not touch that with a barge pole now. And I'm really...
Does Nurka gleefully say, I like it here? Something uncharacteristic, like he just enjoys the mood. Or I guess he also enjoys talking to beautiful women as well.
The line that got me was when they're talking about William and how is the boy doing, and he says, lots of hugs. Lots of hugs.
Yeah.
Francis.
Yeah. When has Urquhart ever hugged anyone?
How do you know what a hug is?
Yeah. But I think you get the feeling, obviously for his own pragmatics, but he's kind of enjoying playing the demon uncle therapist.
I mean, there is that, but also I think it does tie into his capital T Toryism. He is a monarchist to his soul, Urquhart. He's a monarchist to his soul, and he brings down the king, but the preservation of the institution is of paramount importance to him. And it's from episode 1, he's making moves to make sure that if he does what he has to do and get rid of Charles, that he's in with the next gen, And I think that's really, I like that aspect of it, actually. I think that's really fascinating, the way that plays out, because it is, Urquhart's not... I think he says it. The idea of an abolition of the monarchy is abhorrent to him. And even in the final confrontation, even in that final scene where he basically tells him you've gambled everything and you've lost, and demands his abdication, he still bows the head before he leaves.
Do you know what? We touched on that weird scene in the book that involves the sort of dream or race memory, so to speak, of Charles I. Wouldn't it be because obviously the king in Urquhart's final confrontation episode 4 was great, but the bit where Urquhart affronted talks about how he came down here with James I, or James VI, as he would probably say. Wouldn't it be kind of crazy if that Charles I scene was in the early runnings of To Play the King? Because then you'd get the king ultimately being shown up at the end by you have all these delusions of having dreams of your great 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 grandfather. My family was there. Your family, you're a bunch of Germans. What do you know of that? I'm like the deep magic here.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, and I think Urquhart. I mean, that speaks perfectly to Urquhart's deeper, most deeply held prejudices and beliefs and faith. Yeah. That is Urquhart's faith, actually, in Englishness. I mean, it's funny, I was in a completely separate context. I was writing about Ian Fleming, and I hit this riff where I describe one of the things that's hilarious about Ian Fleming's writing is how, and you start to spot it after a while, how it's clear that he considers Englishness to be a superpower, actually. And it really, once you kind of make that connection and you start seeing it everywhere, and it makes reading Fleming even more hilariously enjoyable than it already is, which is one of my great. I don't have guilty pleasures, but if I did, it would be reading Ian Fleming. As is, it's just a pleasure because I'm a freak and I own it. But I think that Urquhart absolutely has that quality in spades. He believes, he does believe Englishness is a super. But what he says it. I mean, his whole national service speech. He goes, "We are not, please God, a nation of," and it's that.
Social workers, well, it's. I should say that I have to say this because my mum's Scottish and my dad's English, so it's an Englishness, but it's an Anglo-Scottishness as well, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's very pronouncedly one, not just through Ian Richardson's own kind of Edinburgh origins and stuff, but Urquhart's
through the character. No, that's a good catch, and you're right, absolutely, and and it probably doesn't go remarked upon enough, but you're right, it's a key component of who he is. But I mean, I have to say, I love this version of Charles. I really do. The performance is so endearing to me, and I think it's actually kind of mind-boggling how he pulls off the trick of just it really shouldn't work. It should look like a bad impression. It should look like spitting image. It should be incredibly embarrassing. It should be toe-curling, and for me anyway, it's kind of painfully charming. I really fell for this guy, and I really felt for him because it was so clear that he was completely intellectually outmatched by the person he was up against.
He makes it as well rounded as you can make a portrayal of someone who's it's got to be a semi caricature, right?
Yeah,
it's got to have. We talked about this in terms of The Crown as well. Yeah, it's got to have a bit of a strand of caricature in it, other's you don't recognise them as much as you need to for the role to work, and that's probably difficult. But I mean, there are some ticks in there, the way he moves his hand and the sort of zzz and things like that, and stuff like that. But I think it's all very restrained and very kind of, and obviously when you're playing a character that, I mean, those scenes in the PM's audiences, just crackle.
Yeah, no, they're fabulous.
And the sort of informal the audience, the audience at the end of episode 3 when they meet in that wonderful flower garden.
Yeah,
and it's just it's set up like a board game or something and was it they have that exchange where the king's like, I do believe you're frightened of me, Urquhart, and he's like, you believe that if it gives you any comfort, so and then strides off in a sort of isometric decision.
Absolutely.
That's one of the best cliffhangers in TV history, I think, low-key.
Oh, it's fabulous. It's absolute, because you do just get that. It's great because it's not even. It's just it's the firing of the starting gun, right? And you just everything, all of the pieces are up in the air, and everything that's happened. It's like, how are they going to land in the last hour? How is this going to resolve? No, it's wonderful, and you're right. All of those scenes crackle. But I also think about the smaller moments, and thinking about it more as we're talking, I realise a large part of how they make him sympathetic is both the characters we talked about already, the two advisors, who are effectively his proxies, but also they're so human that you do kind of feel like, well, if they're gravitated to working with this guy, he can't be that bad, because they really clearly see. But it's also a lot of it's the non-verbal stuff. I keep thinking about his exercise regime And that amazing line where she says, "Why is he doing this? Why is he hitting it so hard?" And the guy says, "Well, he went to school in a particular area. He thinks it's not real unless it hurts."
Yeah, he went to one of those schools.
Yeah, and I think that's such a key observation, because obviously Urquhart and Stamper also went to one of those schools, but they learnt a different lesson about pain. I would argue.
They learnt sadism. He learnt masochism.
Right, and I think that's conservatism and liberalism. Those are the two flavors, right? But yeah, and I think that's really, I think that's really interesting. I think that's really key to the sympathy. Certainly, I felt to his character was this feeling of like, I got the sense of like this man who is a human being, who is, and we're back to that theme about this is what these institutions do, who is crushed by the weight of his responsibilities. He's crushed by the weight of his obligations, and he is just desperate to express this, this compassion that he feels, this, this sense of shared humanity and common humanity and what have you. And I just, it really shouldn't work, and it really does. And it is some of it is in the writing, but you cannot fault that performance, because it takes, I think it takes an incredible amount of skill to land something like that, especially as you say, where you've got to go broad with some of it, or you're not going to land the comparison that you need to land.
There's an interesting thing about the intimacies that they hint at, that that he enjoys to an extent, to a very limited extent, with both David and Chloe, because there's a scene where I think David and Chloe are talking about in a very veiled, tactful sense about he used to send out for people and things like that, the kind of and there's a scene that kind of echoes that, where he's been driven about, and through the sort of Gotham that the London of To Play the King is.
It really is.
It is. You might as well see Michael Keaton's Batmobile doing a lap and the Penguin at the kind of house.
All I'm saying is, if I'm a millionaire doctor, I'm not going to watch Mark Zorro in that cinema. I'm telling you that right now.
No, definitely.
I'll get the VHS and watch it at home.
But you were hinting at the sort of dubious or like surface level presentation this has of anyone who's lower middle class or below. In fact, and this series actually it's good to mention that, because it deals with the idea of the underclass and how the kind of ruling classes try and approach it as a problem to be fixed. But did you know, just before we get into that, because we don't have time for everything,
you could feel me gearing up there, couldn't you? You could hear that. It's like Godzilla.
No, I mean on the laziest IMDb level, did you spot the identity of an actress who plays one of the prostitutes that approaches the king?
No, I did not.
She was an actress briefly before she got a pop career. It's Emma Bunton from the Spice Girls.
No.
Yeah, she's the one who says, it's the old Bill or something like that.
Oh my.
Yeah, that's
goodness.
her.
I didn't even recognise it. That's incredible. Huh.
Yeah. But yeah, the underclass and how to play the king approaches to it. Any thoughts on that?
So again, and I'm gonna, obviously this is, I'm aware that you have listeners from across the political spectrum, and I'm gonna upset some of them with some of what I'm gonna say now. But for me, this is the core of the problem with conservatism versus liberalism, where you allied anything to the left of liberalism, which is that there is no voice for the underclass in the story. They're not real. They're just not. They don't exist. Even when the king meets them, even when the king, the liberal character, goes out on his fact-finding mission, on his, bleeding heart, I'm going to connect with the people, the show itself literally mutes the people he speaks to. We hear him talking to them. We hear the king's voice. We never hear the replies. The music swells, and they are drowned out by the stirring strings of look at the wonderful liberal king doing the thing where he meets the commoners. And it's a problem, man. It's a problem.
And the people we hear seem to be the people who attack David and attack Sarah, or as you say, Stamper's involved.
Yeah, the only working class people we meet are being paid by Stamper to be street thugs. And homelessness is the central issue that they talk about. It's fascinating because, again, for me, it falls into the trap that I'm afraid, in my view, both conservatism and certainly many strains of liberalism fall into, which is it's completely abstracted. These people are homeless, but nobody asks why. And the nearest you get to it, they're homeless because of wider economic factors. Well, no, why? Why are they homeless? Why are these people, why are these human beings on the street? Why do they not have houses to live in. At no point does anyone in the show actually attempt to address that. You have two groups of people. One group of people who say homelessness is terrible and we should do something about it, and another group of people who say homelessness is terrible but it's a necessary evil for economic growth. That's it. That's the entire conversation. We don't hear from them. We don't hear from these, the king's so busy banging on about how terrible it is for these human beings that he never actually, we never actually get the point of hearing what they might have to say about how they got where they did. And look, I know it's not the job of the show, right? I understand that the point is, in the mechanics of the storytelling of the show, they are a symbol. Those people are a symbol of the economic policies of this government and how that plays out. And I'm not arguing with that as such, but I do think it's a weakness. I do genuinely think it's a weakness of the narrative, and it weakens the narrative by not having a functioning opposition that espouses anything to the left of liberalism. So you never hear an argument as to why those people are there, or an alternative, or any solution for it. Because that's the other thing about the king. The king doesn't actually have a solution.
No, he doesn't. But the thing is, do you remember I think it's about episode 2 when Sarah, the king, makes a well-received speech, and Sarah says like, "Well, I'm afraid he's really done it. He's put compassion on the menu on the conversation." What I like that the two, I think this is quite neat actually, because I was going to talk a bit about the messiness of some of the elements of the resolution of To Play the King, but I think a neatness of it is Urquhart has to do two things to win the election, just the way it's presented in the show. He has to do two things. I think one of them is more satisfying than the other. He has to undermine the king's. He has to make the king look foolish, right? And his form of compassion look foolish, and he does that through, I think, a slightly ridiculous. Like, if you're to use Corda and his forces as a superpower, that's maybe too far. The kind of Moss Side set. I don't really know what that's meant to prove either. Really, just like he was unwise to not have tanks next to him.
I mean, my issue with that, and maybe we'll touch on Corda briefly before we finish. But my central issue with that is actually if he has enough power in episode 1 to both fake an IRA terror attack and then have some other unrelated IRA terrorist shot, he can pretty much do anything anyway. Like, why not just shoot the king? I mean, fuck it. You know what I mean? Like,
well, who are those Afro-Caribbean gentlemen who abscond with the king? I mean, who are they? Are they all on the payroll? I don't understand. No. It's done so quickly.
It's really, I had exactly that question occurred to me. Like, is this entire thing a setup? Like, and I don't, because I'm watching it with my JFK brain on, going like, one of them goes like, I'm a patsy, I'm just a patsy. Like, what is happening?
Yeah.
And there's also like the black hole in terms of journalism that bothers me, because like there's that thing about like, and I mean I bow to no one in my distaste for and anger with the venality of our tabloid press in particular in this country, and how supine it is in the face of power. It's a travesty. But that said, and very sincerely meant and felt, even to take recent examples where, police have made claims about injuries caused in protests that turn out not to be true. They turn out not to be true. That gets uncovered by journalists in the space of days. And, I think, it's difficult because I've written about Hillsborough in the past, and I'm very, very conscious of, I don't want to diminish the enormous malignant power that you can get when malign forces within the police and the government interface with the tabloid press. Great injustices can absolutely and are perpetuated under those circumstances, and I don't want to do it. In fact, we should talk about it more often than we do. But it just feels a bit hermetically sealed somehow into Play the King. Like, really nobody's going to report on that. No one's going to ask exactly the questions you're asking. Who were those people?
Yeah.
How did they get there in the first place? And, where did they go after they got bundled in the back of the army van? I mean, the whole thing's like...
Well, we probably don't want to know the answer to that question, but it's I suppose you meant to understand it as a bundling in. It's a bit clumsily put together, I think, but like, a bundling in of that and the scandals with Princess Charlotte, and things like that, and I think what it is it's kind of like a Kinnock falling into the sea kind of moment.
Yeah.
It's kind of it's a moment that makes him look ridiculous and weak, not a moment that undermines him. It's part of a puzzle. But what really interests me is you talk about solutions. No one has a solution to it. Urquhart does, right? Because he goes on TV and he makes the campaign winning speech. Where he for better, and I think you and I would say for worse, he reintroduces conscription. You know, he has this coup,
National service,
which would appeal to a huge part of the British public.
Yep.
Because if the theme of the election is about compassion and what to do with the underclass, Urquhart's got at least surface level solution. You know, he's got a thing that seems to make sense, and the way he talks to the audience and the sort of slightly horrified newsreader through it, it sort of makes a sort of consistent sense for him, doesn't it? And not just in public, the way he talks Sarah through it later on when they're in private. You know, he starts to get slightly megalomaniacal, actually, doesn't he? I think that's one bit where it actually becomes slightly cartoonish, is where he started, you know, then we'll use them to redress the balance of trade. And it's kind of like, it's almost getting a bit Palpatine-y, you know?
I mean, for me, actually, I have to say, I think that's the bit where Sarah's character failed for me. Because that was the moment when I thought, well, like, because Sarah shows disgust at that point of fear. And it's like, nah, you signed up for this, kid. You knew what he was. And you wrote the speech about national service, so you knew where he was. It doesn't quite ring for me, that.
But I see that as working, because in the plot she now knows and believes him to be like a direct murderer.
Okay. Yeah, no, you're right. I'd forgotten that. It does.
So she's able to kid, as we all can. We're all able to kid people. We're able to tell ourselves that people we think are good, right? That the suggestions they make for the country are good. Whatever. I mean, that's something we can say controversially with any end of the spectrum. She now thinks he's bad, so suggestions coming out of his mouth will sound horrific.
That's interesting, but because the implication of that is that, I mean, I take the point, I think, but for me, the implication of that is that, therefore, because the trouble is, the words that are coming out of his mouth are words that actually she put there. So
yeah, and probably focus group.
Yeah, because I mean, I think it's in the story that she wrote the script for his national service speech.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's almost like her breakup present to him.
So, which, by the way, far more impressive than the push polling stuff. So maybe we can give her a bit of credit in terms of having a functioning role there. But so it's interesting to me that what that suggests, if we take your logic forward, is that the revelation about the nature of Urquhart is actually causing her to reevaluate her own political understanding of the world, and that's really interesting. If that is what's going on in that scene, that actually gives it a depth that I'd missed, which I'm really fascinated by. So,
and if she'd lived more than 3 more days, say, that may have gone somewhere.
It might have gone somewhere. But that's interesting, because that is like, that's fascinating. I can think of parallels about, I mean, in really abstract terms, I just think of parallels about how, you experience an institution, and then someone within that institution behaves in a certain way, and for some people, that behaviour will sour the entire institution, and for others, they'll tie it into the individual behaviour. And there's no, I don't think there's necessarily any yardstick you can use for how someone's going to react. But I love the idea that Sarah's sitting in there and she's suddenly like, she is having a "are we the bad guys" moment, right? The full thing, like, oh my god, my entire life's work. And,
full force, and from the fountainhead of it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What have I done? That's lovely. Okay, I like that scene now. I didn't like it before, but I like it now.
Well, that's actually a good point, because I think we'll wrap up discussion of To Play the King in a second. After Urquhart's confronted the king, gone to the palace to demand his resignation, and after the 2 kind of car bombs have been detonated that take out Stamper and Sarah, you get another one of those moments, don't you, in symmetry with the first series, where Urquhart, I think he switches off the radio that's reporting on the deaths, which are again are pegged to the IRA or splinter groups, and he turns to the audience again, and what you get is another version of the ending speech from House of Cards, where he's talking to the audience and talking about how much they wanted all this, and he has that wonderful line, doesn't he, where he's like, things like this happen all over the world. Like it's, and that's specifically a British, what would have been a 95% British public watching this. It's anti-exceptionalism, isn't it?
I love that line, actually. I really, really, really love that line, because for me, as you say, the core of that is anti-exceptionalism, and actually there's something I want to say subversive. I'm not sure if it's quite that strong, but certainly something quite incendiary about that as a final notion. Because I mean, not to get too kind of into the politics of where we are right now, but I personally think we're in a very, very, very scary place right now politically as a country. I think we're probably in a scarier place than America is right now, and that's, and America's got its problems still. But I think I'm genuinely terrified by some of what I see are the signs of of a real movement towards a very, very hard right kind of regime in some of the things that are happening now around the right to protest and around the conversation around patriotism and the teaching of history, and the report, and the early versions of the report certainly that came out today about the nation and about institutional racism and the kind of where we are.
We're recording this on the 31st of March 2021.
Yeah, just go look it up. It wasn't a great day for reporting. So for me to have a show like this actually turn around and say, because for me, I think one of the things that I say a lot, I say it a lot on Twitter, and I've said it a lot on Facebook as well, is like, I put in, the phrase in quotes, "It couldn't happen here," literally every place it's ever happened, right? I'm the thing that terrifies me most about exceptionalism as a concept isn't the jingoism. It isn't even the prejudice that can stem from it, as shocking and as horrible and as abhorrent as it is. What scares me the most about it is the complacency. What scares me the most about it is the way it blinds people to the dangers and the flaws of the system they live in. And for me, the example I always think of, it always gives me like genuine, a genuinely kind of strong negative kind of emotional reaction. I always think about Nick Griffin in the 90s doing the BNP party political broadcasts, sitting on a desk with like a portrait of Churchill and a Union Jack and a collection of war medals that he'd bought at a car boot or something, and just thinking like, you're using the iconography of a generation that, for various complicated reasons that weren't entirely altruistic, I'll grant you, fought Nazis, and you are a Nazi, and the symbolism.
I don't think many people would debate that, however polarised we are now. That Nick
was a Nazi. And the symbolism of that,
yeah.
But that terrifies me. That really does, because a lot of people will look at this, the empty symbolism in Churchill. Christ, we could do a whole... Let's not. But you know what I mean? Like, there's complexities and layers to Churchill that get obliterated by a certain strain of right-wing thought. And it's like... what it ties into is a very simple concept, right? It's my country, right or wrong. And that should terrify any thinking person as a concept, because the wrong that a nation state can do, especially one as powerful as this one, is, something to be reckoned with. And I do think that funny enough, we talked about this, didn't we? This show, this particular part of the trilogy left us both, I think, feeling quite ill, right? Quite kind of, there is something quite nauseating about it. And I appreciate that. I like art that makes me feel, and this definitely makes me feel. And it feels heavier than House of Cards in some way. And I think for me, the reason it does is because it's actually the thing that I find most terrifying about it is Corder. It's the police state. It's the implicit creeping authoritarianism that's already actually terrifyingly advanced, even by episode 1. As I said, we've got the point where the Prime Minister is actually ordering, is actually causing car bombs to be exploded to blame on the IRA to boost his poll ratings, and then having members of that organisation shot in the street, whether or not they had anything to do with it. And by the end of it, is assassinating people who could cause him harm politically. And that closing line is absolutely key to that entire thing. Things like this happen all over the world. Yes, but the whole myth is that they don't happen here. And what this show is saying is, they happen here. And I think that's part of what makes me feel ill, especially, I have to say, watching it in 2021.
But isn't it interesting that, I was talking about the sort of arguing pairs, angel and demons kind of pairs that you get throughout, like this, like Sarah and Stamper and Chloe and David. At the core of this, right behind, slap bang behind Urquhart, behind even his monologues, behind even his relationship with the audience, you've got Corder and Elizabeth, and they don't bicker; they move as one. Yeah. They move as one in an almost kind of telepathic way. Like they don't need any conversation to do what they need to do. They need to talk to Francis. Sometimes.
Well, it's that gag from Ren and Stimpy, isn't it? Evil Ren and apathetic Ren, right? And I mean, for me, actually, I'm glad you mentioned it, because for me, the key shot in the entire 4-part series, and actually probably in terms of narrative, it's probably the pivotal shot of the entire show, the entire trilogy. It's the moment where it spins, is when he calls the party that's going to announce the general election, and Sarah and Stamper have the interaction, and Sarah, bright woman that she is, realizes Stamper doesn't know why the meeting's been called, and Tim runs up to him, and it's that scene from The Office where he's like, just tell me before you tell them, just tell me just before, just tell, assistant to the manager. It's that moment. And Francis says, all in good time.
Yeah.
And then when Francis delivers his speech to everyone, including Tim, who's finding out at the same time as everybody else, who's standing behind him? Elizabeth and Corder. Those are the two figures who are standing behind him. And that's the moment. It's the moment the power shifts decisively away from Stamper and towards those two. And everything...
Yeah, and it does it in a very quiet way in the background of this series.
Yeah. They just. I mean, Corder has what, half a dozen lines in the entire show, but it's all. But when I say it's pivotal, what I mean is like that's also the entirety of the third act. The entirety of the final cut is set up in that moment.
I know this is child's play as well, but isn't it great that he's called Corder? I mean, just to get hammer another Macbeth nail home,
It's so great. I have to admit, I did laugh because I'd forgotten it happens when Francis actually does quote Macbeth in the final. It's kind of too much, but it's Ian Richardson doing Macbeth, so you kind of go, I'll allow it. Yeah. It does. I'll say it does fit with the character.
Well, Corder's great because it's got the Macbeth resonance, but it also sounds like something you'd garrote someone with, doesn't it? So you've got both there.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I mean, because Corder represents the deeply. I mean, that's a kind of a left wing paranoid fallacy, right? The deep state. That's what Corder is, right? He's every lefty paranoia about overreaching straight state violence turn up to 11. He's the absolute boogeyman.
He's so low key, gleeful as well about going about his job in a way that's like it's almost like Stamper but more controlled. And he knows his place, and he's probably even more psychopathic, but he's never going to miss.
Well, he's a true believer, right? I mean, Corder is a true believer, and I love that because I love how that plays out in the final cut, which we'll come back and do whenever we're coming back to do that, because there's a lot more to say about him in that. But I just love. I mean, we talked about this before as well. I think perhaps in the chat, one of the things I'm amazed about is the thematic resonance across the three series. It does feel like a coherent whole to a surprising degree, given the amount of time that elapsed between each production, and it can't possibly. And
the modelled novels and the sort of novel series that it wasn't even meant to be a novel series, and
it can't have been super planned. I don't think so. I think it's a lot of elbow grease on the part of the writers, just making it glue together. But it's incredible how these again. I mean, for me that moment with Corder, just that it's literally right in the middle. It's the fulcrum around which all the rest of the narrative spins. And it's, as you say, very low-key moment in and of itself. It only has the resonance when you rewatch.
And it's funny you mentioned Conan Doyle earlier because, of course, again, in the To Play the King novel, Dobbs makes another attempt to defeat... he doesn't actually kill him at the end of the book of To Play the King, but Urquhart is once again defeated. And once again... I think the book was written at the same time as the novel, as the show. So, it was a bit of a...
Right.
Kind of like 2001. It was a bit of a sort of co-writing thing. But once again, Andrew Davis is the adapter. That just goes, nope. It's just
so great.
It's even more comical when you read the book, actually, because every humiliation and dead at an end, every comeuppance that Urquhart gets in the book, Davis is just nope, he wins that one. No, he wins that one instead. No, he looks great at the end there. It's just,
what I love about that though is that Ian Richardson quote when he did the final cut. I remember him being interviewed in the Radio Times because I was obsessed with the show by that point, and I think To Play the King I watched live from the second episode, and then the final cut I couldn't wait to watch it. But I remember reading a Richardson interview, and he said, I did agree to play the part one more time because evil could not be seen to be victorious. And I love that so much about him, that he was like, all right, I'll do it, but this time he's going down.
Yeah. Although we'll discuss when we do that episode whether in fact, that is the impact of the moral of the final cut. I think he might have been sold some, some bridges there.
Well, look, it's possible he was taking a somewhat narrow view. I mean,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I just as a cap to that, I mean, obviously the actual show ends with, it goes straight from that Urquhart monologue and the sinister, the music, which I'll probably play this podcast out with again because I enjoyed it so much last time. But that ends, you get that sinister shot of quite low budget shot of a sort of simulacra Westminster Abbey and the young new king, aka William, but we don't say the name, being crowned, and then right at the end of the credits, I'm glad I left the DVD playing actually, because right at the end of the credits you get Richardson coming back to say, God save the king, really salaciously, which is just great.
Yeah, it's a lovely moment. I mean, the other thing it did make me think of, like, in terms of, we were talking a little about Elizabeth's reign and how unusual it was. It's something I've remarked upon before, but actually there's a way in which Elizabeth's reign mirrors a similar distortion in British politics, in that you and I grew up, well, certainly I grew up, you came in at the tail end of it maybe, but like the period of Conservative reign that represents the Conservative, the Margaret Thatcher and then the John Major years, up until recently, was kind of unprecedented in terms of British electoral history. British electoral history is 2 Tories, 1 Labour, 1 Tory, 1 Labour, 2 Tories, 1 Labour. Like, forever that's been how government worked. Then we had this run of 4 terms of Tories. Then we had a run of 3 terms of Labour. It looked briefly to me, when the coalition came in, that we were getting back to something that resembled the normality of the status quo that we were used to. I mean, I mentioned this in terms of the monarchy because I'm talking about Elizabeth's longevity. You and I we were talking earlier about how, like, we're not ready for her to die. No one's ready for her to die because she's been there forever now, functionally, and we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to do it. But of course, historically, that's not been the case. Historically, you don't ascend to the throne until you're in your 50s, and you live for 20 or 30 years and you die. And it's
her own success has become a form of problem for the monarchy.
Yeah, it has. But I think what's interesting to me is how that mirrors these really strange, in historical terms, these really strange, distorted periods of political homogeny, both for the Conservatives and for the Labour Party, that we've never seen before. But what I find myself wondering is at what point psychologically does something that is a historical distortion / anomaly become the new normal because of the lived experience? Because we're fairly short-lived creatures. So this kind of is forever for us, and Elizabeth's forever for us, and kind of the Tories in charge is kind of forever for us as well. And it's just weird. And it's weird because the more you think about it, then you start thinking about, like, it really is just about the lens through which you choose to view history. That
traps become increasingly hard to think your way out of as well, to dream your way out of.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, and I just find that really, I mean, I have no answers. This is all just kind of...
Yeah, that's good. I don't either, so this has been a complete waste of time. Thanks, listeners, for being a part of it. But, I mean, Kit, tell us at the end of that where we can find you and where we can find your works.
Sure. I mean, if you want more politics, it's Twitter. So @KitGonzo, where I spend an increasing amount of my time howling into the void about, just anything that's annoying me on any given day. It's very lefty, as you'd expect. You'll see some pop culture criticism in there as well. I've recently been rewatching the Marvel Cinematic Universe with my kid, and I've been live tweeting the experience. So you'll get all kinds of fun stuff there. And hey, it's all free, and it's 208 characters, so it doesn't take long to read. If you don't like it, you can move on. My fiction work is widely available wherever books are sold. I've got a novel called God Bomb, a couple of novellas and novella collections, short story collections, all kinds of good stuff. If you look for Kit Power on Amazon, you can, under books, don't look for me under the general search, because what you'll end up is lots of solutions for Power of Attorney, which won't do you any good at all. Oh, maybe it will, but it won't do me any good. What's the point? But yeah, Kit Power on the books, you'll find my author page there. Everything that you want is available on ebook or paperback. If you're interested in the paperbacks, a desperate plea to buy the paperbacks from your local bookshop if you're still lucky enough to have one, because they desperately need your business and Amazon doesn't. My non-fiction work, I write mainly about horror at Ginger Nuts of Horror. I have a theoretically monthly column there called My Life in Horror, where you can catch up with me talking about things like Superman 3, actually, where I, essays about childhood horror influences in the widest possible sense. That project's wrapping up soon, but there's about 50 essays there that you can dive into if you want to. And if you really enjoy what you're getting with the output with the writing and you're interested in engaging more, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/kitpower. For as little as $1 a month, you get something new from me every week. Sometimes that will be non-fiction, sometimes that will be fiction, sometimes that will be podcast material, but something new every week for $1 a month. So if you have really enjoyed yourself and you want to chuck me a buck and get some cool stuff, then go check it out.
That's so you've not been up to much then. Bit of a dry period.
I was doing a bio. I just had a piece. I've got a piece coming out I've got a piece coming out tomorrow. In fact, that a commission for an April Fool's piece writing about a fake Ian Fleming James Bond novel as though it existed, and I do my bibliography, and I actually say in my increasingly inaccurately described spare time I podcast because it's getting a bit much.
Well, I get that, yeah. Well, I'll leave it there then. But thanks for joining me once again, Kit, and love to have you back in the future.
No, thanks so much. I think we, if you could stand it, I think we have to close the trilogy out, don't we? That would be.
I think we owe it to our audience now, don't we? Our theoretical audience.
We owe it to. Hey, don't apologise. They know what they did. Okay.
Yeah, they sure do. All right. Well, thanks to Kit, and that's goodbye from me, and goodbye from yourself, Kit.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @d_Fagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert. As promised, I just wanted to get your thoughts about the Northern Independence Party stuff that kind of, at least in the Twitter sphere, is blowing up this week. Because obviously I know you're not living in the North, but and I'm not either. But I did grow up in the North, and you're like me. You're a Labour Party member, and there's a lot of sense in which the Northern. I mean, I don't know when this podcast comes out. This podcast is going to come out pretty soon. Actually, things won't have moved ahead that much. We won't have had the Hartlepool by-election yet, in which the Northern Independence Party, for the casually politically engaged, are standing a candidate, and not just a candidate, but Thelma Walker, who was until recently a Labour MP. You're obviously, I mean, from your Twitter chat alone, Kit, obviously you're someone who doesn't agree with everything about the direction of the Labour Party currently, and every decision that the current Labour Party leadership makes. I think that's a fair characterization, isn't it? The Northern Independence Party seems to be mostly made up of people who feel quite similarly. What are your thoughts about that? I know it's a huge. That's like a whole other podcast, but just
it's really difficult. I mean, we kind of. I know you and I have tiptoed around this before in terms of, talking about Scottish nationalism, right, and the SNP in particular, and I finally kind of sort of broke radio silence on that on Twitter recently, and I did get into a bit of debate with someone who is in Scotland who supports the SNP, and I was I'm quite happy with how that conversation went, because we didn't just stay friends. I think we became better friends as a result of it. I certainly didn't change his mind, and he certainly didn't change mine. But what I was happy about was just being able to have a rational conversation about an honest disagreement. And that made me feel good, because that's quite difficult at the moment. I think that the Northern Independence Party is it feels to me to be an inevitable consequence of both the success of the SNP and I don't know any other way to describe it than the failures of the current Labour leadership.
And the longer term Labour Party, of course.
Sure. Yeah. That's been in decline for some time. I can't help but find it incredibly depressing. Okay, I mean, my core kind of belief on all of this stuff is that for any kind of left leaning politics to work, it requires solidarity. That to me, that's an irreducible component of leftism. It's kind of what leftism's for, but it's also, for me, increasingly I realise it's kind of what it is, if it's anything at all. And I bow to no one in heartfelt critiques of the Labour Party, past, present and future, as a imperfect, flawed delivery system for any kind of socialism. And I absolutely would not seek to kind of disparage those people who honestly believe that at this point that the Labour Party represents a waste of their energy. I understand the people who feel that way. I completely disagree with them, but I also completely understand them. I understand how they've got to that conclusion, and it is possible to respect someone's opinion and disagree with it, and I do. I respect the people who feel that way. I do disagree with them. For me, it comes down to the irreducible problem that we have in this country is we don't have a functioning democratic system. We have an archaic first past the post system that obliterates nuance, obliterates third parties, let alone fourth, fifth, sixth parties. And the history of first past the post, fairly immutably, I would argue, is that what it means is that any time you create a rift on one side of the political spectrum, you effectively cause an electoral advantage to the other side. And I hate everything about that. For me, we should have an electoral system where every politician has to fight for every vote. For me, we should have an electoral system where you don't have this obscenity where one Tory MP is worth, I'm plucking the figures out of the air, but you get the idea. You can look it up for yourself. There's a version of this. Every Tory MP is worth 20,000 votes. Every Labour MP is worth 35,000 votes. Every Liberal Democrat MP is worth 120,000 votes. Every Green Party MP is worth 2 million votes. That is an obscenity.
Yeah.
That's not a functioning democracy. That's a failure. And that's the system that we live in and breathe and don't even question.
Yeah.
And it's not just flawed, it's broken at this point. So that's accepting that I find that abhorrent. It's also the facts on the ground as we are right now in 2021, and given those facts, any political movement that seeks to but that will inevitably weaken the left vote by splitting it is just a terrible idea in my view.
What worried me, and I'm really not sure we're dismissive of the Northern Independence Party here, apart from anything else, we're talking on one side of the historical by-election that might be a bit of a damp squib for them, or might be a bit of a wellspring to kick something off. We don't know at all. What depresses me a bit about it is, let's say we have another general election in 2023, 2024. I've read various estimates of when that will be. that such is our system that's even a question at all, you know.
Yeah.
But what it makes me think is if the Tories at the next election are got rid of or weakened or, you know, reduced or forced into minority government again, whatever happens to them, whatever their outcome, it's looking increasingly like the coalition of parties that do that will be a very fragmented. It was reminding me of places like Turkey and Israel, you know, where like the only, I mean, Turkey particularly actually, where the only hope of getting rid of increasingly autocratic right-wing governments is this very, very beyond fragile coalition of, you know, leftist, liberal, regionalist, especially regionalist parties that can barely work together enough to win an election and usually don't, you know. It's just, I mean, so on a pragmatic level, what if you think of the ideals of nationalism, you know, whether if you see the UK as a kind of an imperial rump of a state that should be broken apart for the right, I mean, all power to you. I mean, that's, I can't argue on an emotional level with that, you know, but just pragmatically in terms of getting rid of very powerful right-wing hegemonies, it doesn't seem like it's got much legs.
I mean,
really.
you know, I find the idea that we're going to create a socialist utopia by chipping off a region at a time, you know, I mean, maybe. I don't think so. I don't think it's going to work. And to me, the lesson of the SNP so far is that it doesn't work, I'm afraid. That's my lesson of that. You know, I have to say as well, I struggle with nationalism as identity politics. I have a huge amount of sympathy for identity politics in other forms, but actually the nationalism, I'll own it and call it a kind of instinctive distrust of it, an emotional distrust actually. And I think if anyone's being kind of remotely intellectually honest, they'll understand what I mean if I just say the phrase, the English National Party. If such an entity existed, what would it look like? What does it immediately evoke in your mind? I know what it evokes in my mind. The British National Party, and we know what they were like. I accept absolutely that the SNP are not, you know, they're not a far right party. They're not a right wing party. Obviously, and I do don't get me wrong, but I have an inherent suspicion of and mistrust of politics that are rooted in national identity. I think it's dangerous.
So is it that you think they're by and large, you know, I'm obviously not to generalise, they are thousands and thousands and thousands of people, but like, you know, the party as a structure is a well-meaning one that is channeling something dangerous? I mean, we really are talking about brass tacks ideology here, and I'm gonna own that before I go any further. Like, I'm an internationalist, you know. I believe in humanity. I believe in an ideal world of no borders. You know, I think national boundaries do more harm than good. I think they do more to divide us than they do to unite us. I think we have an obsession with as a species with accentuating trivial differences in really dangerous ways to create jingoism that allows entrenched power structures to go to war with each other over resources and kills like millions of people. And you know, I can't it's one of the things I constantly struggle with the SNP side of the debate is I can't quite get past that, to be honest. I can't quite get past, and it's not that I don't have every sympathy in the world for any Scot who is also a socialist who looks at the last 100 years of British history and says, why should I be governed by these Sassenachs? Right? Like, seriously, I get it, because I live in England. I don't want to either. I mean, the argument, funny enough, the argument I had with this guy talking about it with Scotland, I said, you know, why not the People's Republic of Liverpool? You know, Liverpool is a city that is, you know, it's a port. It's a city, you know, they could set up as a city-state tomorrow, right? Liverpool has not voted Tory ever, right? And yet they are governed by a Westminster Tory government and have been for most of their lives, because most of us have for most of our lives, because they're who keep winning. Like, is this a sense the kind of where would it end kind of argument? I mean, or a form of it.
So I am inherently suspicious of the slippery slope argument. Like, I resist it actively. I think it's lazy thinking. I think that in the real world, actually, all the time, we make decisions about where we draw the line, and we make decisions about when we're going to move it and where to. And slippery slope is just an argument for the status quo, and it's a knee-jerk argument for the status quo. And I reject it, actually. I don't think it stands up as an argument. I'm not arguing slippery slope, because now what we're seeing is actual cause and effect. That's not slippery slope. We're in a situation now where you've had the SNP, people have seen the success of it, and now it seems to me there's an attempt to replicate that in another part of the country. And I don't think it's the answer to the question. I just don't. But I think the answer to the question is everybody with that frame of mind should join the Labour Party tomorrow, overthrow the current leadership, install it. And I understand anyone who would look at me and say, we just tried that and it didn't work. I get it. And, I'm a member of the Labour Party as long as they don't kick me out for saying things like this, and I'll continue to agitate for the Labour Party to be the kind of thing I want it to be. But I also have to say this. I voted for Tony Blair. I campaigned in the election, in Gordon Brown's attempt to become elected as Prime Minister. Now, those are two human beings and two Prime Ministers who I have many profound, bone-deep, furious disagreements with in terms of the policies they enacted. I think they did despicable things in government. I also know for a mortal fact that they were the least worst option in the elections in which I voted for them and campaigned for them. And I actually do believe also that Keir Starmer currently is the least worst option if I have to choose between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. And actually, that's not a particularly close call either. And that doesn't mean that I don't think Keir Starmer is, in many ways, awful. I actually do think he's awful. I also think I struggle sometimes. For me, I think there is an intellectual unseriousness, frankly, in some on the left that really disappoints me. And one of those is when they say, well, if it's a choice between Starmer and Johnson, what kind of choice is it? The same kind of choice it's always been, kids. A really, really crappy one, but not a difficult one.
I think it's and this year we don't really have time for this, but I think it's the echoes of Milibandism in Keir Starmer that worry me more than the idea that he might be a Blairite or even a Brownite. It's just the kind of the feel that we're getting into this kind of what will probably be quite a sloggish kind of few years where we just have a bunch of quite embarrassing stuff happen and none of it works.
That's really interesting, because I'd settle for Milibandism at this point. I really. Oh God, I'm gonna get so much hate mail for this. I didn't mind Ed Miliband. I think he was badly advised, but I think he's a decent politician actually, like at core, and a decent guy. And and actually, you know what? It may be the same. It may be the same with Starmer. It may be that he's surrounded by terrible advisors. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of unknowable, isn't it? You have to judge people by their actions at the end of the day. But yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I agree that yeah, I mean, it certainly seems to be very much within Starmer's kind of wheelhouse that we'll end up with something like the Edstone, right? I mean, yeah.
This is just a different era as well, and it's so much more polarised. And I don't just mean that in general, I mean like in terms of the Labour Party, because basically every portion of the Labour Party is more pissed off and defensive than they were in 2014-15, because the right is very defensive from recent experience. The left had no hopes of anything in 2014, so now they kind of do, but they're completely crushed as well. Like everyone's just in a much, to simplify things slightly, everyone's in a much worse mood than they were then.
Yeah, and I think we talked about it last time as well, off the record. But I think that and it relates directly to what you just said. No one in the Labour movement has really dealt with the whiplash of 2017 and 2019. Nobody's reckoned with it intellectually yet. We're all still dealing with it emotionally, and I include myself in that 100%. I still kind of can't make sense of either of those election results, either of them, and it's very, very tempting to fall into either of the narratives. I mean, the two immediate emergent narratives that I can think of. One of them is, Corbyn would have won it in 2017 if the centre and right of the party hadn't been sabotaging him internally with all those leaked WhatsApps and the blah 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 blah, and then enabled the press in annihilating him in 2019, right? Or the counter argument, which goes, people voted for Corbyn because they didn't think he was going to win in 2017. And that's the only reason the result was as close as it was. And actually 2019 was the restoration of the norm that was inevitable once people looked at Corbyn for any length of time. And the thing is, the killer is, you look at the facts and they completely support either of those narratives. As far as I can tell, anyway. I mean, I haven't done a super deep dive, but I know which one I know where my sympathies lie.
Yeah.
But I couldn't hand on heart tell you I've done the work to tell you, yes, actually it is this version of narratives that's the correct one.
Well, I think Labour. Because everyone focuses on if you count the 2010, which you should really, the 4 Labour defeats at general elections that we've been through. But they're all quite odd general elections as well. And I think particularly the 3 most recent ones you talk about 2017 and 2019. I think people kind of don't add on 2015 because that was it's a trio of headfuck elections.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, because losing. It's funny we end on Scotland actually again. Losing Scotland was disturbing. It was disturbing, like, because 2017 and 2017 was confusing and 2019 was tragic,
yes.
But 2015 was, like, I think a gut punch is. I say this, because I'm half English, I'm half Scottish. I've lived in England, I've lived in Scotland.
Right.
Part of my identity is, I've tried to say this to a nationalist friend of mine, is sort of soft unionist in the sense I'm kind of built out of that,
Right.
And I'm on the left as well, I like to think, so I'm kind of
trying
to make sense of a world in which Labour is no longer a force to steer the country at times, a feasible force. It's really upsetting.
No, it is. It is upsetting on a visceral level. The other interesting thing that you reminded me of when you talked about those 4 election defeats as well, of course, is that 3 of them were incredibly close. 3 of those 4 were incredibly close, And I mean, I think for me, the things that Labour still haven't reckoned with are, one, exactly what you just described, the annihilation in Scotland. I think one of the biggest failures of the Corbyn era. I really did think that the Corbyn era was going to revitalise Labour in Scotland. I really thought Corbyn had a shot at doing that because I thought the SNP can't pull the stunt they've been pulling for the last 10 years of calling him a Tory. It's not going to wash because he just ain't. This guy's a real deal socialist, and I really thought he would be able to make some inroads on policy in Scotland and pull voters back. And I have to say, I mean, I don't know, but it doesn't look to me like he even tried, and I don't know if that's a failure of reporting or if it's a failure of initiative or what. But from the outside, it doesn't really look like. I don't know why the hell Labour thinks they can win a general election if they can't start winning in Scotland again. It drives me crazy. I don't get it. I don't get what seems to me to be effectively surrender that's happened there.
Well, I guess also the SNP very quickly realised after in its relatively minor recovery from 2017 that it had a sort of 60% Remain voting audience that it could if it played its cards right, and it did. It could out-Remain both Labour and the Lib Dems without any queasiness.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Point.
It just worked to the Scottish electorate more than that.
You're right. It's always easy to forget just how much of a distorting influence Brexit had on the last, at least the last 2, arguably, maybe even the last 3 elections. That's a really good point, and that's well made. That's fair comment. But I think for me it felt, and again we're talking about feelings, but it felt like we were absent the field. We didn't even try and fight, and I don't really understand that. And that really bugged me about the Corbyn project. And the other thing is, like, I remember vividly a real deep sense of unease when I can't remember. I think it was the local election results before the general in 2017, but there was this line. I remember a news reporter saying, like, Labour have shed votes, but Corbyn seems to be lucky in that he shed votes in places where Labour can afford to shed them. And I remember thinking, like, that doesn't sound good to me. That doesn't sound like a viable long-term strategy.
Yeah.
And let's not. The thing that interests me on an intellectual level about the Northern Independence Party is, narratively, it's very confusing, because the narrative is the Red Wall crumbled I mean, I'll never forget the vox pop of the guy who just, who said to BBC or ITV News, yeah, I had to wait till Dad died before I could vote Conservative. That, I cannot tell you the chills that gave me, because that really scares me. If that is any, I mean, it's a vox pop, but if that is any indication at all of what's happened up there, then Labour's hole is far deeper and far scarier, and we may not be at the bottom of it yet either.
Because it really was just empty tradition in some spots.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's horrifying. Again, on a kind of existential level, that's pretty horrifying. But the other thing that makes me think about is, then what does an avowedly, I think, as far as I can make out, an avowedly socialist but also weirdly nationalist northern, because if the purpose of this party is to peel off disaffected Corbyn voters, then their appeal is not going to reach those red wall Labour switch to Tory voters, unless I'm completely wrong about that. And I can see a possibility where what's happened is the shift that we're all missing, except the Tories, is that the shift has gone it's not about party political identity anymore, it's about populism. And if that's the real shift that's happened, then populism can be left-wing as well as right-wing. And then maybe they could. The thing that I keep thinking about, the thing that I can't stop thinking about when I start thinking about this stuff, I find it haunting. Something Billy Bragg said when I saw him in Glastonbury in the left field tent in like 2009 maybe. He was talking then about the BNP and the way they eventually routed the BNP in that last round of local elections. But you remember there was that period where they were winning all over the place for a while. Yeah. And he said the thing that you've got to understand is we had council estate voters who'd voted Labour their whole lives, and then they voted UKIP, and then they voted BNP, and then they went UKIP again. And then I know from more recently, to update the anecdote, some of them went back to Labour when Corbyn came in. Mm-hmm. Now, I have to accept the fact of that. But at the same time, what that also makes clear to me is that fundamentally, I am very, 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 very different from a lot of people in this country in terms of how I think about politics and how I engage with it. Because that, to me, makes no sense. It makes no sense. I cannot, I just intellectually, I cannot chart a political path that goes Labour, UKIP, BNP, UKIP, Labour. I can't do it. But it's a real thing. It's a real journey that's happened. And what that means is I can't just look at the Northern Independence Party and write it off and say that's not going to have an impact. My fear is it'll do what it says on the tin. It'll peel off disaffected Corbyn voters. It'll split the Labour vote and the Tories will win. And traditional politics say that's what will happen, right? That's what, and first past the post, brutal as hell, I still think is the most likely outcome. But I can't entirely discount something completely different happening, because politics, the other thing that we, to go back to what you were saying about the results, I don't think we've ever had a more volatile period in our political history in terms of the amount of and the scale of the shifts that have happened election to election. So that was a really, really long-winded way of saying I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen.
No, that's fine. I'll take that. I mean, but I just wanted to finish by saying I think a lot of the people are arguing for the Northern Independence Party, and we will revisit this in a future episode. We'll see how they did, and we'll talk about it further. But like, a lot of them get thrown back. Well, look at UKIP. They were like this single issue party, and they never, they won one MP in their history and stuff. And they're like, yeah, but look where we are now. And I was like, yeah, I mean, because what I mean, to give them their credit, is a lot of them are like, they know they're going to split the vote. Some of them want to save Labour, some of them think it's beyond saving. Yeah. But and that's the thing I would just say, and the reason I'm not planning, well, several reasons really, but I'm not planning to join the Northern Independence Party anytime soon, is I just think that the people who are joining it and campaigning it for it to give Labour a wake-up call, that's fine. You actually might. This will also take on a life of its own. Yeah. If successful, and regionalist parties and nationalist parties, they are attractive causes, and it will go in directions you perhaps don't want it to go.
Yeah, and I also think fundamentally, and I think this is true of political power, whether you're talking about union organisation or party politics or indeed local organising, I think fundamentally, I do believe it's fundamentally wrong-headed to really think that you have more power to influence outside the organisation than you do inside it. I just think that's wrong on the face of it. I actually think that's wrong-headed. I think you always have more influence inside than you do outside. And the idea of I understand the argument about the wake-up call. I understand the argument about trying to do this to save Labour, but I do firmly believe it's fundamentally wrong-headed as an approach. Stay in a fight, recruit your friends, bring them in, fight, for crying out loud. And I say that, as I said, I have every respect in the world for the people who have made a different decision to me and who are no longer in the party, and I understand why. And the people who decided direct action is the way to go, I respect that as well. And I think we undervalue the impact that direct action can have. I think actually one of the things that the more I thought about this subject and developed my understanding, the more appreciation I've had for the impact of direct action in terms of dragging the argument in a direction you want it to go in. And I think there is more to be done there. But again, I come back to, and I'm not, it's a terrible thing to say at this point. I'm not even necessarily advocating for people to remain in a party that they don't feel comfortable in. I get that, but if genuinely your project is save the Labour Party from itself, you will have infinitely more influence inside the party than you will outside, in my view, in trying to do that.
And we'll leave it at that. Thanks, Kit.
All right, thank you so much.